For months, across several quiet neighborhoods, people kept reporting the same strange experience. A car appearing late at night, two strangers inside watching silently from the shadows, asking unusual questions, then vanishing before anyone could understand why. At first, the reports seemed unrelated, until investigators discovered the same vehicle appearing again and again on empty streets after midnight. What they uncovered next was not a violent crime, but something far more unsettling. A couple secretly studying human behavior in the real world, turning quiet neighborhoods into psychological experiments without anyone's knowledge. This is the chilling story of Ricky Davis and Dena Riley, the mysterious late-night observers who believed no one was watching them, until the investigation finally caught up. Chapter 1. A Quiet Beginning. The unlikely meeting of Ricky Davis and Dena Riley. The story of Ricky Davis and Dena Riley does not begin with violence. It begins, like so many unsettling stories do, with something that appeared ordinary on the surface. In the calm neighborhoods and quiet streets where their lives first intersected, nothing seemed unusual. The air of normalcy was so convincing that for years, the darker truths hiding beneath it remained completely invisible. To understand how this story unfolds, it helps to begin with the individuals themselves. Ricky Davis was often described by those who knew him casually as quiet. Not particularly memorable, not especially social, but not suspicious either. He moved through life with a certain stillness that many people interpreted as shyness. Neighbors remembered seeing him occasionally, offering brief greetings or polite nods, never staying long enough in conversation to reveal much about himself. There was something about Ricky that allowed him to blend into the background. In many ways, he seemed like a person who preferred the edges of social spaces rather than the center. People who interacted with him rarely left those encounters with strong impressions. Instead, they remembered something else, an unusual calmness. It was not warmth exactly, but rather a controlled, measured presence. Dena Riley, on the other hand, carried a very different energy. Those who encountered her often described her as expressive, animated, and sometimes unpredictable. She could be charismatic when she wanted to be, able to draw people into conversation with an ease that contrasted sharply with Ricky's quieter personality. Where Ricky seemed reserved, Dena seemed emotionally intense. She spoke passionately, sometimes dramatically, and could quickly shift from friendliness to irritation if a conversation took a turn she didn't like. At first glance, they appeared to be opposites. And yet, people who later studied their relationship would suggest that this contrast may have been exactly what drew them together. Their meeting, according to later accounts gathered by investigators, was not dramatic or unusual. It happened in a way that countless relationships begin, through overlapping social circles and chance encounters that slowly became more frequent at the time. Neither of them stood out as people destined for notoriety. Friends and acquaintances simply saw two individuals who seemed to understand each other. But relationships, like stories, often contain early clues that only become visible in hindsight. In the early days of Ricky and Dena's relationship, there were small moments that might have appeared insignificant at the time, but later raised questions. Subtle changes in behavior, increasing isolation from friends, a growing sense that the two of them were forming a world that revolved almost entirely around each other. For some couples, this kind of closeness might simply look like intense affection. For Ricky and Dena, it slowly became something else. Those who spent time around them noticed that Ricky seemed to grow more confident in Dena's presence. He spoke more when she was nearby, sometimes adopting her opinions almost immediately during conversations. Dena, meanwhile, seemed to take on a more dominant role within the relationship. She often guided decisions, spoke on Ricky's behalf, and sometimes interrupted him mid-sentence as if she already knew what he was about to say. To casual observers, it looked like a strong personality paired with a quieter partner. But beneath that dynamic, something more complex was developing. Psychologists who later examined the case would describe relationships like theirs as a kind of reinforcement loop. One personality providing direction, the other providing compliance. One shaping decisions, the other validating them. Individually, each person might have behaved differently. Together, however, their dynamic created something far more unpredictable. Over time, Ricky and Dena began spending increasing amounts of time alone with each other. Their social circles narrowed. Invitations from friends became less frequent, partly because the couple themselves appeared less interested in attending gatherings. Isolation can happen gradually. Often, the people experiencing it don't recognize it while it's happening. But investigators studying the timeline of events years later noticed something important about this period. It marked the beginning of a shift in their lives, a shift away from ordinary routines and towards something darker. Neighbors would later recall seeing the two of them together frequently, sometimes late at night, sometimes leaving unexpectedly for long drives that seemed to have no clear destination. When asked about their plans, their answers were often vague. Just getting out for a while, just clearing our heads, just taking a drive. These explanations sounded harmless enough, and in most cases, they probably were. But occasionally, the details surrounding those trips would become difficult to explain later. Gas receipts from distant locations, hours unaccounted for, unusual stories that didn't quite match the timelines people remembered at the time. None of it seemed alarming, because people rarely imagine the worst about those around them. It is one of the most powerful illusions of everyday life. The belief that the people we encounter are living lives similar to our own. Routine, predictable, safe. But as investigators would eventually learn, the relationship between Ricky Davis and Dena Riley was slowly evolving into something far more troubling than anyone realized. And the quiet beginning of their story would soon lead into events that would capture the attention of detectives, journalists, and criminologists for years to come. Because behind the ordinary appearance of their lives, a darker narrative was already beginning to take shape. Point one, that few people could see, and even fewer could have predicted. The early signs were subtle, the changes gradual, but in retrospect, this was the moment when the story truly began. The moment when two individuals, bound together by an unusual connection, started moving down a path that would eventually lead investigators to ask one haunting question. How did no one see it coming? As the months passed, the relationship between Ricky Davis and Dena Riley appeared, to outside observers, to settle into a quiet rhythm. The kind of rhythm many couples eventually develop. Routines that feel predictable, habits that slowly shape everyday life. Yet for those who would later study the case, this period of calm became one of the most important phases in understanding what happened next, because beneath the ordinary patterns of daily life, something more complicated was taking shape. Ricky Davis seemed increasingly comfortable allowing Dena Riley to guide their shared decisions. Friends who encountered them together often noticed how he would pause before answering questions, glancing briefly toward Dena as if waiting for her reaction. Sometimes she would respond before he did. Other times she would gently correct him, adding details to his statements or steering the conversation in a slightly different direction. Casual acquaintances. This might have looked like a typical dynamic within a relationship. One partner more talkative, the other more reserved. But investigators who later reviewed accounts from people who had known them during this time noticed a pattern. Dena often framed situations in ways that subtly reshaped how Ricky interpreted events around him. If a neighbor made an offhand remark, she might suggest that it sounded insulting. If a stranger looked at them for too long, she might interpret it as disrespect. These interpretations, repeated over time, began to influence Ricky's perception of the world outside their relationship. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a form of gradual perspective shaping, a process where one person slowly alters the way another understands everyday interactions. And as Ricky and Dena spent more time together, that shared worldview grew stronger. They increasingly relied on each other's interpretations of situations rather than the opinions of others. That it was during this time that their social circle began shrinking even further. Some friends drifted away naturally, the way friendships often fade when people's lives move in different directions. Others seemed to withdraw more deliberately. One acquaintance later told investigators that spending time with the couple sometimes felt tense in ways that were difficult to explain. Conversations could suddenly become uncomfortable if a disagreement appeared, even a small one. Dena had a way of dominating those moments, turning a minor difference of opinion into a lengthy argument about respect or loyalty. Ricky usually remained quiet during those exchanges, but when he did speak, he often supported Dena's perspective. Over time, fewer invitations came their way, fewer casual visits, fewer opportunities for outside influences to enter their lives. Isolation does not always arrive dramatically. More often, it arrives quietly, through missed phone calls, canceled plans, and the slow fading of connections that once felt routine. And within that increasingly private world, Ricky and Dena seemed to become more dependent on each other. Their conversations, according to later interviews with people who had occasional contact with them, often revolved around perceived grievances, small frustrations with neighbors, complaints about employers, stories about strangers who had supposedly behaved rudely or suspiciously. Individually, these stories might have seemed insignificant, but when repeated over time, they helped build a shared narrative, one where the outside world appeared increasingly hostile or untrustworthy. For Ricky, whose naturally quiet personality already kept him somewhat distant from others, this narrative may have reinforced a growing sense that Dena was the only person who truly understood him. For Dena, the relationship seemed to provide a platform where her interpretations of events went largely unchallenged. Together, they created a private echo chamber, but a place where doubts rarely entered and outside perspectives held little influence. Neighbors would later remember occasional arguments between the couple, though these moments rarely lasted long. The arguments seemed intense while they happened, but they often ended abruptly. Soon after, the two of them would appear together again, calm and composed, as if nothing had occurred. To people watching from a distance, it simply looked like the normal ups and downs of a relationship. But investigators studying the timeline later suggested that these arguments may have served a particular purpose. Conflict, followed by reconciliation, can sometimes strengthen certain types of bonds. The emotional intensity reinforces a sense that the relationship itself is the center of both conflict and resolution. In other words, the relationship becomes the place where problems are created, and also the only place where they can be solved. Over time, that dynamic can make the outside world seem less relevant, less trustworthy, less important. And gradually, that appeared to be happening with Ricky Davis and Dena Riley. The more time they spent together, the more self-contained their lives became. Long drives late at night continued to be a common habit. Sometimes they would disappear for hours, returning well after midnight. When asked where they had been, their explanations remained vague. Just driving, just talking, just getting away from everything for a while. But there were moments when those explanations left small inconsistencies, that a location mentioned that didn't match the direction they had been seen traveling, that a time estimate that didn't quite align with the distance involved. The time, these details seemed too minor to raise suspicion. No one imagined that the answers might matter someday. Yet investigators would later revisit those quiet evenings with great interest, because during this early stage of their relationship, something else was happening, something far less visible than their growing isolation. That Ricky's personality seemed to be changing, slowly, subtly. Friends who encountered him after long gaps sometimes noticed that he seemed less hesitant when expressing frustration about other people. His tone had shifted. Where he once appeared indifferent, he now sometimes spoke with a quiet resentment about perceived slights or disrespect. These remarks were rarely dramatic. They were delivered calmly, almost thoughtfully, but they suggested that the shared worldview he and Dena had been building was beginning to shape his outlook more deeply. And in the quiet, ordinary spaces of their lives, during late-night conversations, long drives, and hours spent away from others, that worldview continued to evolve. That no one outside their relationship could hear those conversations. No one could observe how their ideas about the world were changing. But years later, when investigators attempted to reconstruct the path that led to the events that would eventually shock so many people, they returned again and again to this early period, because this was the time when the foundation was laid. The quiet stage where influences took hold. The moment when two individuals began reinforcing each other's perceptions in ways that slowly moved them further away from the ordinary expectations of society. And though the world around them remained largely unaware, the path they had begun walking together would eventually lead far beyond those quiet streets where their story started. At first, the changes were almost invisible, but like distant thunder before a storm, the early signs were already there, waiting. Chapter 2: Beneath the Surface. Early warning signs no one understood. In the early stages of any unsettling story, there are often small moments that later feel significant. At the time they happen, they rarely appear dramatic or alarming. Instead, they pass quietly through everyday life, blending into ordinary routines. Only much later do people begin to revisit them, asking questions that once seemed unnecessary. In the case of Ricky Davis and Dena Riley, those early warning signs were scattered across months of seemingly uneventful days. Neighbors remembered occasional disagreements that sounded sharper than typical arguments between couples. Friends recalled conversations that suddenly turned uncomfortable when certain topics arose. Acquaintances noticed that the pair sometimes spoke about other people with an unusual level of suspicion. Individually, none of these details seemed remarkable, but taken together, they hinted at something slowly changing beneath the surface. Dena Riley often spoke with strong opinions about loyalty and trust. During conversations with acquaintances, she would sometimes describe situations in which she believed people had betrayed or disrespected her. These stories were often emotional and vivid. But what caught the attention of some listeners was how frequently those stories involved perceived insults that others might have dismissed as minor misunderstandings. That a neighbor who once shared a brief conversation with investigators recalled one such moment. During a casual discussion about everyday frustrations, Dena suddenly began describing a recent encounter at a local store. According to her, a stranger had looked at her in a way she interpreted as mocking. What struck the neighbor was not the story itself, but the intensity with which she told it. The event had been brief, yet Dena described it as if it carried deep personal meaning. Ricky, standing nearby during that conversation, nodded quietly in agreement. Moments like this happened more than once. Over time, people who spent time around the couple noticed that Ricky increasingly adopted the same interpretations of events that Dena expressed. If she believed someone had been disrespectful, he seemed to accept that conclusion without hesitation. If she expressed distrust toward a neighbor or acquaintance, Ricky often echoed those suspicions soon afterward that it created an unusual pattern. Rather than forming opinions independently, the two appeared to reinforce each other's perceptions. Psychologists sometimes describe this dynamic as a form of emotional amplification. When two individuals repeatedly validate each other's interpretations of events, those interpretations can grow stronger over time, even when they begin with very small incidents. Within the private space of a relationship, those shared beliefs can evolve without challenge. And because Ricky and Dena had gradually withdrawn from many outside friendships, there were fewer voices offering alternative perspectives. Their world was becoming smaller, and within that smaller world, their ideas about the people around them began to shift. During this period, Ricky's demeanor also appeared to change in subtle ways. People who had known him before he met Dena often described him as reserved but generally calm. He rarely expressed strong emotions in public and seemed content to stay out of conflict whenever possible. But as time passed, those who encountered him began noticing occasional flashes of irritation. Nothing dramatic. Just brief moments where his tone seemed sharper than before. That a coworker who later spoke with investigators described a conversation in which Ricky complained about a minor disagreement with someone he barely knew. What struck the coworker was how intensely Ricky seemed to interpret the situation to him. The disagreement was not simply a misunderstanding. It was, in his words, a sign that people think they can get away with things. The remark lingered in the coworker's mind later, though at the time it seemed too vague to question further. Meanwhile, Dena appeared increasingly protective of their relationship. She often spoke about the importance of standing together against anyone who might try to interfere or create problems for them. Sometimes these comments were delivered jokingly. Other times they carried a tone that felt more serious. But because they occurred in casual settings, people rarely challenged them directly. Over time, a quiet pattern developed. The couple seemed to view the outside world with growing suspicion, and the outside world, in turn, gradually stopped paying close attention to them. Neighbors noticed that Ricky and Dena often kept to themselves. Their routines became less predictable. Some evenings they stayed home for long stretches of time. Other nights they left suddenly, driving away without explanation and returning hours later. To late-night activity was not unusual in their neighborhood, so these departures rarely attracted attention. But investigators reviewing timelines years later would become interested in these movements because patterns began emerging. Trips that seemed spontaneous often occurred on the same days each week. Certain destinations mentioned in passing were located surprisingly far from their home. And occasionally, the explanations they gave about where they had been did not match the time it would have taken to travel there. The time. These inconsistencies meant very little. Friends and neighbors rarely track each other's schedules with such precision. But when detectives later began reconstructing the events surrounding the case, those small details became part of a much larger puzzle. Another subtle change occurred during this period. Ricky and Dena began speaking more frequently about the idea of control, not necessarily in obvious ways, but in small remarks about how important it was to stay ahead of people who might try to manipulate or deceive them. These conversations sometimes appeared philosophical, almost abstract, yet they hinted at a growing preoccupation with power dynamics. Who had control in a situation, and who did not? One acquaintance remembered a moment during a group discussion when Dena described people as falling into two categories: those who take advantage of others, and those who allow it to happen. The comment was delivered calmly, but it created an uneasy pause in the conversation. Ricky nodded as she spoke. Moments like this were easy to forget, until later, because in hindsight, these conversations revealed something important about how the couple's thinking was evolving. They were beginning to frame the world as a place where control mattered above all else. where strength and weakness defined relationships between people, and where loyalty within their own partnership was the only certainty they trusted to at the time. No one imagined that these ideas might eventually connect to something far more serious. But the warning signs were there, quiet, subtle, almost invisible within the flow of everyday life, like faint cracks beneath a calm surface. Cracks that would eventually widen into something impossible to ignore. And though the people around Ricky Davis and Dena Riley continued living their lives unaware, the dynamic between the two of them was slowly becoming more intense, more isolated, more unpredictable. The early warning signs were present, but no one yet understood what they meant. As the relationship between Ricky Davis and Dena Riley deepened, the subtle changes that had begun appearing in their lives continued to evolve. None of these changes were dramatic enough to cause immediate alarm. Yet taken together, they created an atmosphere that some people later described as difficult to explain. It was not that the couple behaved in openly alarming ways. In fact, most of the time they appeared calm and composed. Conversations with neighbors could be polite. Casual interactions at stores or public places often passed without incident. But every now and then, a moment would occur that left a faint impression on the people who witnessed it, that a slightly intense reaction to a harmless comment, a conversation that shifted abruptly into suspicion, that a disagreement that escalated faster than anyone expected. These moments rarely lasted long enough for people to fully process them. The tension would rise, then fade just as quickly, leaving behind only a vague sense that something had felt unusual. For Ricky Davis, the transformation seemed gradual but noticeable to those who had known him earlier in life. Where he had once appeared hesitant to express strong opinions, he now spoke with more certainty about situations involving other people. Sometimes he described interactions as if they carried hidden meanings or intentions that a passing glance from a stranger could become, in his interpretation, a deliberate challenge. That a brief disagreement could be framed as a personal attack. The shift was subtle, but it reflected a growing pattern of interpretation, one that increasingly mirrored Dena Riley's own way of viewing the world. Dena herself seemed to thrive in discussions about perceived injustices. She spoke with conviction about the importance of standing up for oneself and refusing to tolerate disrespect. That on its own, that perspective might sound reasonable. Many people value strength and independence. But what stood out to some listeners was how often Dena framed ordinary social interactions as tests of loyalty or authority. If someone disagreed with her, she sometimes interpreted it not as a difference of opinion, but as a challenge to her standing. During one conversation recalled later by an acquaintance, Dena spoke at length about the idea that people often hide their true intentions behind politeness. According to her, the only way to protect oneself was to recognize those hidden motives before they had the chance to cause harm. Ricky listened closely during that discussion, and when he spoke, he echoed many of the same ideas. Moments like that reinforced the sense that the two were building a shared philosophy, a way of interpreting the world that gradually separated them from those around them. Over time, their routines became even more unpredictable. Neighbors noticed that their late-night drives continued, sometimes occurring several nights in a row. The couple would leave quietly, their car headlights disappearing into the darkness of empty streets, only to return hours later. To anyone casually observing the pattern, it might simply have looked like two people who enjoyed nighttime drives. But what made those trips stand out later was how little detail they ever shared about them. If asked where they had gone, their answers remained vague. Just driving around. Just thinking. Just getting away from everything for a while. For investigators examining the timeline years later, these unexplained journeys became points of interest because certain dates connected to those drives would eventually overlap with other events. events that, at the time, had seemed unrelated. Another subtle change began appearing in the way Ricky and Dena interacted with people in public settings. At times, they appeared unusually observant. Instead of casually moving through spaces like restaurants or stores, they sometimes seemed to study the behavior of others around them, watching, listening, taking note of small details. Point one acquaintance later described a moment in which Dena appeared intensely focused on a nearby conversation between strangers at a cafe. Though the conversation had nothing to do with her, she listened carefully, then quietly commented afterward that people often revealed more about themselves than they realized. Ricky agreed. These moments suggested a growing fascination with understanding how other people behaved, what they said, how they reacted, how they responded under pressure. Individually, these observations might have seemed harmless. But within the context of their increasingly isolated relationship, they hinted at a deeper pattern. The couple seemed to be developing a heightened awareness of human behavior, almost as if they were studying it. Meanwhile, the outside world continued moving around them. Friends who had once been close gradually drifted away. Some found it difficult to maintain contact because the couple often declined invitations or canceled plans. Others simply sensed that the dynamic between Ricky and Dena had become too intense to navigate comfortably. By the time several months had passed, their social circle had grown remarkably small. Most of their time was now spent either alone together or in brief interactions with strangers who knew little about them. Isolation can have powerful psychological effects. Without outside perspectives, beliefs and ideas can grow stronger within a closed environment. For Ricky and Dena, that environment appeared to be reinforcing the worldview they had been building together, a worldview shaped by suspicion, control, and loyalty. And as those ideas deepened, the couple's bond appeared to grow even stronger. To them, it may have felt like unity, like understanding, like two people standing together against a world they believed could not be trusted. But to investigators who would later reconstruct these early stages, this period represented something else. It was the quiet formation of a partnership unlike most others, the partnership where each person's thoughts and interpretations amplified the others, the partnership where isolation allowed those ideas to grow without challenge, and a partnership that, over time, would begin moving in directions that no one around them could yet imagine. Because the early warning signs were present, they existed in conversations, in patterns of behavior, in moments of tension that passed quickly enough to be forgotten. But like distant signals barely visible on the horizon, they hinted that something deeper was unfolding, something that had not yet revealed its full shape, something that would eventually draw the attention of investigators searching for answers. And when those answers finally began to emerge, people would look back on this quiet period with a mixture of disbelief and unease, because the clues had been there, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be understood. Chapter 3: A Dangerous Bond. When obsession became partnership, as time passed, the connection between Ricky Davis and Dena Riley began to take on a deeper intensity. Relationships naturally evolve as people spend more time together, but in their case, the bond seemed to grow unusually strong, almost as if their identities were slowly merging into a single shared perspective. Those who occasionally crossed paths with them. The pair appeared inseparable. They arrived together, they left together, and during conversations, they often spoke as if their thoughts were perfectly aligned. At first glance, it could easily be mistaken for devotion, but the deeper investigators later looked into their relationship, the more complex that bond appeared. Ricky Davis had once been known as someone who kept his opinions to himself. He rarely stood out in groups and seemed comfortable letting others take the lead in conversations. His quiet demeanor often made people underestimate how closely he was observing the world around him. Yet, as his relationship with Dena Riley deepened, that quiet observation began to transform into something else: confidence. Not the loud, charismatic kind that draws attention in a crowded room, but a quieter confidence rooted in certainty. When Ricky spoke, he increasingly did so with conviction, and very often, his words mirrored Dena's own views. Dena Riley possessed a strong personality that naturally commanded attention. She spoke quickly and passionately, sometimes weaving together long explanations about how people behave, why conflicts happen, and how power operates in relationships that to some listeners. These discussions sounded thoughtful to others. They felt unsettling, because beneath her confident tone, there was often an assumption that people around her were acting with hidden motives. That it was a belief that seemed to shape the way she interpreted everyday events. If someone made a passing remark, she might interpret it as sarcasm. That if someone declined an invitation, she might see it as a deliberate rejection. And when she explained these interpretations to Ricky, he rarely questioned them. Instead, he appeared to absorb them. Over time, their conversations seemed to revolve around analyzing the behavior of others. Why did someone say a particular thing? What did they really mean? Were they trying to gain an advantage? This kind of constant interpretation can slowly reshape how people view the world. When every interaction is examined for hidden meaning, ordinary situations can begin to feel like subtle competitions for control or respect. For Ricky and Dena, that perspective seemed to deepen their connection, because every conversation reinforced the same idea: that they understood the world better than others, that they could see motives others missed, that they needed to rely on each other above anyone else. The more they talked, the stronger that belief appeared to become. Their routines also began to reflect this growing partnership. They spent long hours talking late into the night, sometimes sitting in their car during those now familiar drives through quiet streets and empty highways. Those drives had become something of a ritual, that a space where they could talk without interruption, that a place where their ideas could develop without outside voices. That it was during these late-night conversations, investigators later believed, that the foundation of their partnership truly solidified, because the topics they discussed were no longer limited to small frustrations or everyday grievances. Their conversations began exploring larger themes: control, power, influence. Dena often spoke about the importance of understanding how people react under pressure. According to later interviews with individuals who occasionally overheard parts of these conversations, she seemed fascinated by the idea that human behavior could be predicted and manipulated. She described situations where people reveal their true nature when placed in uncomfortable circumstances. Ricky listened carefully, sometimes asking questions, sometimes adding his own observations. The two of them appeared to enjoy analyzing hypothetical situations, imagining how different people might respond to unexpected events. To an outsider, these discussions might have sounded like philosophical debates about human nature, but the frequency and intensity of these conversations hinted at something deeper. They were not just talking about behavior, they were studying it. Meanwhile, the outside world continued to fade further into the background of their lives. Former friends rarely heard from them anymore. Neighbors saw them occasionally, but rarely engaged in long conversations. Even casual acquaintances noticed that the couple seemed less interested in maintaining social connections. Instead, Ricky and Dena appeared content within their own private world. And inside that world, their partnership grew stronger. One of the most striking aspects of their relationship, according to later investigators, was the way each seemed to validate the other's ideas without hesitation. That if Dena proposed an interpretation of a situation, Ricky reinforced it. If Ricky expressed frustration about someone's behavior, Dena intensified that perspective. Together, they created a feedback loop, that a dynamic where their thoughts became increasingly aligned. Over time, this kind of reinforcement can lead to a shared identity within a relationship. Point two people who begin to see themselves as partners not only in everyday life, but in a broader sense of purpose. For Ricky and Dena, that sense of partnership appeared to carry a growing sense of exclusivity. They often spoke about how others could not truly understand them, how most people were too predictable, too unaware, too easily influenced. Comments like these may have sounded like harmless frustration at first, but they revealed a mindset that was gradually separating the couple from the society around. Dumbed out a belief that they existed slightly outside the rules that governed everyone else. That belief would later become a key element in understanding how their actions evolved, because as their bond strengthened, their willingness to question those rules appeared to grow as well. That late night drives continued. Conversations grew longer, and the quiet streets they traveled became the backdrop for discussions that would eventually take their relationship into far darker territory. But during this period, the transformation was still subtle, still hidden behind the appearance of an ordinary couple living an ordinary life. In '01, watching them from a distance could have predicted where that partnership would lead. Yet the foundation had already been laid. Point two people bound together by a shared worldview. Point two individuals reinforcing each other's ideas. Point two minds slowly moving in the same direction. And though the world around them remained unaware, the nature of their bond was beginning to shift from simple companionship into something far more powerful, something that would soon move beyond conversation. As Ricky Davis and Dena Riley's relationship continued to deepen, the intensity of their connection began shaping more than just their conversations. It began shaping their decisions. What had once appeared to be two individuals simply spending a great deal of time together slowly became something more structured, almost strategic. Their lives started revolving around shared plans, shared interpretations, and increasingly, shared ambitions about how they wanted to navigate the world. To anyone casually observing them, nothing seemed dramatically different. They still appeared calm in public. They still carried themselves with the quiet confidence of two people comfortable in each other's company. But subtle behavioral patterns were becoming more pronounced. One of the most noticeable changes was how often they began discussing situations in terms of advantage. During conversations with acquaintances, Dena sometimes spoke about how people reveal weaknesses without realizing it. She described human interactions as though they were contests of awareness, situations where some individuals understood the hidden dynamics of power, while others moved through life completely unaware. Ricky listened carefully to these ideas. Over time, he appeared to adopt the same language. Instead of speaking casually about disagreements or frustrations, he began describing them in terms of who held control within a situation. If someone challenged him or dismissed an idea, he sometimes interpreted it as a deliberate attempt to assert dominance. This perspective was subtle but important. It reframed everyday experiences into a kind of quiet competition. And because Dena reinforced those interpretations, the perspective became stronger each time it was discussed. Together, they began to see the world less as a place of random interactions and more as a landscape of hidden power struggles. This shift in thinking also influenced how they spent their time. The long drives that had once seemed spontaneous now appeared to follow certain patterns. Sometimes they traveled far outside their usual neighborhoods. Other times they drove through areas they had rarely visited before. According to information later examined by investigators, these trips often involved long stretches of quiet conversation punctuated by moments of focused observation. They would stop at unfamiliar locations, sit in the parked car for extended periods, and simply watch the world around them. Watching people entering and leaving stores. Watching traffic move through intersections. Watching how strangers interacted in public spaces. For Ricky and Dena, these observations seemed to serve a purpose. They were studying behavior, learning patterns, discussing how individuals reacted to different environments and situations at times. Their discussions reportedly turned theoretical. They would imagine how a person might respond if confronted unexpectedly, how stress could change decision making, how fear might influence someone's ability to think clearly. To an outside listener, such conversations might have sounded like abstract discussions about psychology, but within the private space of their partnership, these ideas appeared to hold a deeper fascination. They weren't simply curious, they were engaged, curious about how control could shift in moments of uncertainty, curious about how quickly a situation could change if someone understood the dynamics involved. Meanwhile, the world around them remained largely unaware that anything unusual was taking shape. Neighbors continued living their daily routines. Acquaintances who occasionally encountered the couple saw nothing that demanded attention. If anything, Ricky and Dena appeared increasingly self-contained, a pair comfortable existing within their own rhythm. Yet this isolation was quietly strengthening the dynamic between them. Without outside influence, their shared worldview continued evolving. Ideas that might once have been questioned by friends were now accepted without challenge. Interpretations of events became more confident, more absolute. And with that growing certainty came a stronger sense of partnership. They began describing themselves as a team. Two people who understood each other in ways no one else could. Two people who could rely on each other without hesitation. In some ways, that kind of connection can be powerful in any relationship. But in their case, the connection appeared to carry an undertone of exclusivity, an unspoken belief that their partnership placed them slightly outside the social expectations that governed other people. During one conversation recalled later by an acquaintance, Dena reportedly said something that lingered in memory long afterward. She remarked that most people follow rules simply because they are told to, not because they truly understand why those rules exist. The comment was delivered casually, but Ricky nodded in agreement. Moments like that revealed how their thinking had evolved. Rules and expectations were no longer seen as fixed boundaries. Instead, they appeared to view them as flexible, something that could be navigated, tested, perhaps even ignored under the right circumstances. Over time, this perspective created a quiet sense of confidence between them, not the kind that draws public attention, but a private confidence rooted in the belief that they understood situations differently than those around them. The late-night conversations continued, sometimes lasting until early morning hours, sometimes carried out during long drives across empty roads. Within those conversations, their ideas about human behavior, control, and power grew increasingly elaborate. They analyzed hypothetical situations in detail, discussing how people might react when placed under pressure, exploring how small decisions could influence larger outcomes. These discussions were never overheard in full by outsiders, but fragments of them, remembered by acquaintances and later pieced together by investigators, painted a picture of two individuals deeply fascinated by the mechanics of influence. They weren't simply reacting to the world anymore. They were beginning to imagine how they might shape this stage in their story. Those ideas still existed primarily as conversation, thought experiments, speculation about how situations might unfold, but every idea discussed between them reinforced the same underlying principle, that together they could navigate the world differently, more deliberately, more strategically, and as that belief grew stronger, the partnership between Ricky Davis and Dena Riley began moving beyond ordinary companionship. It was becoming something else, that a collaboration, a shared vision, shaped by long nights of conversation and quiet observation. Point one, built on trust between two people who believed they understood the world in ways others did not, and though no one around them realized it yet. That partnership was slowly approaching a point where ideas would begin turning into actions. Chapter 4: The First Shadows. Crimes that almost went unnoticed. In many criminal investigations, the earliest stages of a case rarely begin with something dramatic. Instead, the first signs often appear quietly: small disturbances, unusual reports, or minor incidents that seem unrelated at the time. For investigators who later studied the case connected to Ricky Davis and Dena Riley, those early signals were scattered across different places and moments, each one too small on its own to attract immediate attention. At first, there were only fragments that a report filed by a local resident about suspicious activity late at night, that a passing mention from someone who remembered an uncomfortable encounter with two individuals whose behavior felt strangely calculated, at a handful of observations that seemed unrelated, separated by time and distance. None of these incidents initially raised serious concern, but when examined years later, they revealed something important. They marked the earliest shadows of events that would eventually draw the attention of investigators. During this period, Ricky and Dena continued living what appeared to be ordinary lives. Their routines, though somewhat isolated, did not stand out dramatically within their community. Neighbors still saw them occasionally, sometimes walking quietly through the neighborhood, sometimes leaving in their car late at night, their headlights briefly illuminating empty streets before disappearing into the darkness. Those late-night drives remained a consistent pattern, but as investigators would later discover, the nature of those trips had begun to change. What had once seemed like aimless wandering now appeared to involve a greater level of intention. The couple often traveled to unfamiliar areas, places where they had no obvious connections and no clear reason to visit. Parking lots, quiet side streets, locations where people move through quickly without paying close attention to strangers. For long stretches of time, they would simply sit in their car and observe, watching, waiting, studying the flow of activity around them. Anyone passing by, the car might have looked like it belonged to someone waiting for a friend or taking a break from driving. Nothing about it would have immediately raised suspicion, but the repeated pattern of these visits suggested something else: the quiet form of preparation. Around the same time, a few minor disturbances were reported in areas that investigators would later connect to the couple's movements. These incidents were not initially treated as serious crimes. Some involved small acts of property damage. Others involved brief confrontations between strangers that ended before authorities arrived. Each report was handled individually, often filed away with little follow-up once it became clear that no significant injuries or losses had occurred. Yet when detectives later reconstructed the timeline, they noticed that some of these incidents occurred on nights when Ricky and Dena had been traveling through the same areas. The connections were not obvious at first, but patterns began to emerge. One particular event, though minor at the time, would later attract special attention. Late one evening, a resident walking through a nearly empty parking area reported noticing a car parked near the far edge of the lot. Inside were two people who appeared to be watching the surroundings very carefully. When the resident approached closer, the car's engine started suddenly, and the vehicle drove away without explanation. The witness later described the moment as strange but not threatening. At the time, it simply seemed like an awkward encounter, perhaps two people who felt uncomfortable being observed. The report was brief and quickly forgotten. But years later, when investigators reviewed witness statements, connected to the case. The description of that vehicle would begin to sound familiar, because the behavior matched a pattern that appeared again and again in other reports point to individuals that a parked car, careful observation of people nearby, and sudden departure when noticed. For Ricky and Dena, these encounters may have felt like small experiments. Moments where they tested their ability to remain unnoticed in unfamiliar environments. Moments where they observed how strangers behaved when something unusual occurred nearby. Meanwhile, their conversations continued exploring the same themes that had fascinated them for months: control, reaction, human behavior under pressure. The difference now was that those ideas were no longer confined entirely to theory. They were slowly being explored in the real world. Another subtle shift occurred during this period in the way the couple spoke about risk. In earlier conversations recalled by acquaintances, their discussions had focused mostly on observation and interpretation. But now, according to fragments remembered later, their language began including references to limits. How far someone could go before attracting attention. How much disturbance could occur before authorities became involved. These comments were not made publicly or in ways that raised immediate alarm. Instead, they appeared during private conversations, often framed as hypothetical questions about how systems respond to unexpected situations. But taken together, they suggested something important. Ricky and Dena were no longer just discussing human behavior. They were beginning to explore boundaries. Boundaries of attention, boundaries of consequence, boundaries of control. Meanwhile, the small disturbances reported across different areas remained isolated events in the eyes of local authorities. None of them appeared serious enough to trigger major investigations. Clear suspects were identified. Strong connections linked the incidents together, and without those connections, the early signs of a larger pattern remained hidden for investigators who would eventually study the case in depth. This period represented a crucial turning point, because it was here, in the quiet space between observation and action, that the partnership between Ricky Davis and Dena Riley began crossing an invisible threshold. The ideas they had spent months discussing were beginning to take shape beyond conversation. Their late-night drives had become more purposeful, their observations more focused, their curiosity about human behavior increasingly tied to real-world situations. But at the time, no one around them could see the pattern forming. The disturbances were too minor, the connections too subtle, and the individuals involved too careful to attract attention. The shadows were there, but they were faint, barely noticeable against the ordinary rhythm of everyday life. And because of that, the early steps in this unfolding story passed almost completely unnoticed. As the months progressed, the quiet pattern of late-night movement and unusual observations surrounding Ricky Davis and Dena Riley continued to develop in subtle ways. Nothing about their behavior yet resembled the kind of activity that would trigger a major investigation. Instead, the situation remained buried within scattered reports, isolated memories, and minor incidents that seemed too small to connect. In many criminal cases, this stage is where the story hides the longest. Small disturbances occur. Witnesses recall unusual moments, but without a clear pattern tying everything together, the events fade quickly from attention, and for a long time, that is exactly what happened. During this period, the couple's late-night drives became even more frequent. Sometimes they would leave home well after midnight, when most neighborhoods had already fallen silent. The streets were quieter then, and public places had fewer people moving through them. For Ricky and Dena, the timing appeared deliberate. Empty roads offered privacy. Quiet parking lots allowed them to remain unnoticed, and unfamiliar locations meant they were unlikely to encounter people who recognized them. From the outside, nothing about their movements seemed remarkable. People drive late at night for countless reasons, clearing their heads, enjoying quiet roads, or simply passing time. But investigators reviewing their timeline years later noticed something different. These drives often involved long pauses. Instead of continuously traveling, the couple would stop in various locations and remain parked for extended periods. Sometimes the stops lasted only 10 minutes. Other times they stretched past half an hour. During those pauses, witnesses occasionally remembered seeing the occupants of the car watching the surroundings very carefully, not casually glancing around, but observing with focus, paying attention to who entered and exited nearby buildings, watching how people moved through public spaces, tracking patterns that most passers-by never noticed. To someone unfamiliar with the couple, such behavior might have seemed harmless curiosity, but when these observations were combined with the couple's earlier fascination with human behavior, investigators began to suspect that something more deliberate had been taking place. Around the same time, additional minor incidents began appearing in areas connected to those nighttime drives. Point 1 involved a brief confrontation reported by a pedestrian who described being approached by two individuals asking unusual questions about the neighborhood. The conversation had been short and ended quickly when the pedestrian appeared uncomfortable. Another report involved a driver who noticed a car following at a distance for several minutes before suddenly turning away at an intersection. Neither situation escalated into a serious incident. No injuries occurred. No clear crimes were reported. And because the individuals involved could not provide detailed descriptions of the people they encountered, the events remained unsolved curiosities rather than active investigations. Yet for detectives who would later reconstruct the case, these early encounters offered important clues. They suggested that Ricky and Dena were gradually testing how people reacted to unexpected interactions, observing behavior, measuring responses, seeing how quickly someone might grow suspicious or uncomfortable. That in many ways, these interactions resembled small experiments. And the more they conducted them, the more confident the couple appeared to become. Confidence can grow quickly when early actions produce no consequences. When behavior goes unnoticed or unchallenged, it can reinforce the belief that boundaries are flexible. For Ricky and Dena, that reinforcement seemed to deepen the sense of control they already believed they shared. Their partnership, built over months of discussion and observation, now extended into the real world in quiet ways. Small actions, small tests, moments where they could observe how situations unfolded without attracting attention. Meanwhile, the outside world continued treating these incidents as isolated curiosities. That a strange conversation here, an uncomfortable encounter there, without clear connections between them. The events never reached the threshold required to trigger deeper scrutiny. This lack of attention allowed the couple's activities to continue largely undisturbed. Neighbors still saw Ricky and Dena occasionally during daylight hours. They appeared calm and composed, carrying on with everyday routines that blended seamlessly with those around them. No one suspected that their quiet lives included nights spent observing strangers in unfamiliar places. No one imagined that the ideas discussed during their long drives might eventually lead somewhere far more serious. And perhaps most importantly, no one yet realized that the early disturbances scattered across different neighborhoods shared a common thread. The individuals behind them remained unknown, invisible, just another pair of strangers passing briefly through the night. But the pattern was slowly growing. Each new incident added another piece to a puzzle that investigators would eventually struggle to assemble. Because while the disturbances themselves remained minor, they revealed something important about the direction Ricky and Dena's partnership was taking. They were becoming more comfortable operating outside ordinary social expectations, more willing to interact, with strangers in unpredictable ways, more curious about how people behaved when confronted with unusual situations. The line between observation and participation was beginning to blur, and although the world around them still saw nothing more than scattered odd encounters, the quiet progression of events suggested that their curiosity was moving towards something more direct, something more dangerous. But at this stage, the signs were still too faint to draw attention, too scattered to connect, too subtle to alarm the communities where those encounters occurred. And so the shadows continued growing slowly, unnoticed beneath the surface of everyday life. Because in the early stages of many investigations, the most important clues often appear long before anyone realizes a story has begun. And for Ricky Davis and Dena Riley, those clues were already forming a trail, one that would only be understood much later. Chapter 5: Escalation. The pattern begins to emerge. By the time the first real concerns began to form in the minds of investigators, Ricky Davis and Dena Riley had already spent months refining the quiet patterns that defined their lives. Their partnership had grown beyond simple companionship. It had become a system, a rhythm, an unspoken understanding between two individuals who believed they saw the world more clearly than the people around them. To outsiders, their lives still appeared mostly ordinary. During daylight hours, they moved through public spaces without attracting attention. Grocery stores, gas stations, small errands. Nothing about those moments seemed out of place. But beneath that ordinary routine, something had begun to change. The late-night drives were no longer simply about observation. They had become something more deliberate, more focused. And with that shift came the first signs that their curiosity about human behavior was beginning to evolve into something far darker. During one evening drive that investigators would later reconstruct through witness accounts and location records, the couple traveled nearly 40 miles away from their usual area. It was an unusual decision. Most of their previous trips had stayed within familiar regions, but on this night, they chose somewhere new, somewhere quiet. A place where the streets were dimly lit and activity slowed dramatically after midnight. Parking lots sat nearly empty, businesses closed early, and the silence of the area created long stretches of stillness between passing vehicles. For Ricky and Dena, that environment offered something valuable: predictability. When human activity becomes sparse, patterns become easier to see, easier to study. That night, their car reportedly remained parked near a row of closed storefronts for nearly half an hour. A witness later remembered noticing the vehicle simply because it had been sitting in the same place for an unusually long time. Inside the car, the couple appeared to be watching the street carefully. The witness described the scene as strange but not alarming. Two people sitting in a car at night did not automatically suggest anything unusual. Eventually, the vehicle drove away, slowly, almost cautiously. At the time, the moment passed without further thought. But what investigators later discovered was that this evening marked a turning point in the couple's behavior, because after that night, the pattern of their trips changed again. Instead of simply observing public spaces from a distance, Ricky and Dena began engaging with their surroundings more directly. Small interactions began appearing in the timeline of events: short conversations with strangers, questions asked in quiet areas, moments where the couple deliberately approached people before quickly moving on. None of these interactions resulted in crimes serious enough to trigger official investigations. Yet the encounters left faint impressions on those who experienced them. Several individuals later described feeling unsettled by the couple's behavior, though none could fully explain. One person remembered being approached by a man and woman who asked unusually detailed questions about how often people passed through the area late at night. Another recalled being asked about nearby roads, and whether police vehicles commonly patrolled them at the time. These questions sounded like harmless curiosity, but when investigators later compared witness accounts, they noticed a pattern. The questions always revolved around the same themes: timing, movement, visibility. They were not random conversations. They were attempts to understand how environments functioned when few people were watching. For Ricky and Dena, these moments likely felt like experiments. Each interaction provided information. How did strangers react to unexpected questions? How long did conversations last before someone grew suspicious? How quickly did people disengage when something felt uncomfortable? These were the kinds of observations that fascinated the couple, because each answer revealed something about human behavior under uncertainty. Meanwhile, the couple's conversations continued exploring ideas about control and reaction. During long nighttime drives, they reportedly discussed how quickly situations could shift when people felt unsure about what was happening around them. Uncertainty, they believed, created opportunities, moments when ordinary expectations broke down, moments when individuals hesitated. And hesitation, in their view, meant vulnerability. These discussions may have felt theoretical at first, but slowly, they began influencing the couple's actions. One of the most striking aspects of this stage was how calm the pair remained. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden outbursts of aggression. Everything happened gradually, measured, controlled. For Ricky, the transformation appeared especially significant. The quiet man who once avoided attention now seemed increasingly comfortable navigating unpredictable situations. Witnesses who encountered him during these nighttime interactions described him as calm and composed, soft-spoken, almost polite. But there was often something else beneath that calm demeanor, a sense that he was studying the person he was speaking to, not simply listening, observing, analyzing. Dena, meanwhile, maintained the more assertive presence between the two. She often guided conversations, steering questions toward the topics that interested them most. Her confidence helped create the illusion that their interactions were harmless, just two people making conversation during a late-night drive. But beneath that surface, something else was happening. Information was being gathered, patterns were being understood, and the couple's confidence was growing with each successful encounter. Because so far, no one had challenged them. No one had called authorities. No one had recognized the larger pattern forming behind these small interactions. That absence of consequence can be powerful. When actions repeatedly go unnoticed, the sense of risk begins to fade. And with fading risk comes growing boldness. For Ricky Davis and Dena Riley, the quiet experiments that once defined their nighttime drives were slowly evolving into something more deliberate, something more daring. The line between observation and action was beginning to blur, and although the world around them still saw nothing more than an ordinary couple passing briefly through unfamiliar neighborhoods, the internal dynamic between them had already shifted. Their partnership was no longer just about studying the world. They were beginning to test it. As the weeks turned into months, the quiet experiments that had defined Ricky Davis and Dena Riley's late-night excursions continued to evolve. What once appeared to be harmless curiosity about human behavior was slowly shifting towards something more deliberate. The pair had spent countless hours discussing how people respond to uncertainty, how environments change when attention disappears, and how quickly normal routines can be disrupted. Now those ideas were beginning to influence the way they approached the world outside their car windows. The change did not happen suddenly. It unfolded gradually, one small decision at a time. During several nighttime drives, the couple began lingering longer in certain areas they had previously only observed from a distance. Parking lots where only a few vehicles remained after closing hours became regular stops. Dimly lit side streets near convenience stores and gas stations drew their attention as well. From these locations, they could watch how people behaved when they believed they were alone. Most of the time, nothing unusual happened. A driver pulled into a gas station, filled the tank, and left within minutes. Someone stepped out of a late-night cafe carrying a takeout bag before disappearing into the darkness of an empty street. But occasionally there were moments that seemed to fascinate Ricky and Dena. Moments when people hesitated. Moments when someone glanced around uncertainly before returning to their car. Moments when the quiet atmosphere of the night created a feeling of vulnerability. The couple's discussions often returned to those moments. They would replay what they had seen, analyzing how individuals reacted to unfamiliar surroundings. Dena frequently described these situations as examples of how easily routine behavior could be interrupted by small changes in the environment. Ricky listened carefully, adding his own observations. Together, they began forming conclusions about how predictable human reactions could be under certain circumstances. The more they talked, the more confident they appeared to become in their understanding of these patterns, and with that confidence came a new level of boldness. During one particular evening that investigators later reconstructed through scattered witness recollections, Ricky and Dena drove through a commercial district that had mostly shut down for the night. Only a few businesses remained open, their neon lights reflecting faintly on the nearly empty road. The couple parked across the street from a small convenience store that still had customers coming and going. For nearly 20 minutes they watched. People entered the store one at a time, stayed briefly, and then returned to their cars. The routine was simple and repetitive, exactly the kind of pattern the couple had grown interested in studying. But on this night, something different happened. That a person leaving the store paused beside their car, appearing to search for something in a bag. For a moment, they stood alone under the dim glow of a street lamp. It was the kind of moment Ricky and Dena had talked about many times. A brief pause in routine. A moment when someone was distracted. From the parked car, the couple watched carefully, and no one knows exactly what was said between them during that moment. The windows of their vehicle remained closed, and the quiet street carried no sound beyond the hum of distant traffic. But according to later interpretations by investigators, that moment may have marked a psychological turning point, because after several seconds, the engine of the car started. The vehicle moved slowly forward, and although nothing dramatic occurred that night, no crime reported, no confrontation documented, the action itself suggested something important. They had crossed a line. For months their activities had remained passive, observing, discussing, analyzing. But now they were beginning to move closer to the situations they once studied only from a distance, approaching, testing, exploring how those patterns behaved when they themselves entered the environment. Witnesses who later recalled seeing the car that evening described it moving slowly past the store before disappearing down a side street. Nothing about the moment seemed threatening. Yet when detectives later placed that sighting alongside other reports, the timing stood out. It was one of the earliest moments when Ricky and Dena appeared to shift from observers into participants. And once that shift began, their behavior continued evolving. Over the following weeks, their nighttime drives became even more purposeful. They returned to some locations multiple times, carefully noting how the environment changed depending on the hour or the day of the week. Weekends brought more activity. Weeknights offered quieter streets. Late hours meant fewer witnesses. These patterns fascinated them, and with each new observation, their confidence appeared to grow. For Dena especially, the sense of control seemed to become part of her identity. Conversations with acquaintances during this period sometimes included remarks about how predictable people could be if someone simply paid attention. She spoke about awareness as though it were a rare skill, something most individuals lacked. Ricky often nodded in agreement. Their partnership had evolved into a shared philosophy about how the world worked. Point one built on the belief that they could understand situations more clearly than others. Point one built on the idea that ordinary routines created opportunities for those willing to notice them. And although their actions had not yet drawn the attention of authorities, the subtle shift in their behavior suggested that something deeper was unfolding. The experiments that once involved simple observation were now involving movement, presence, interaction with the environments they studied. Meanwhile, the communities they passed through remained largely unaware that anything unusual was developing. The people entering late-night stores or walking through quiet parking lots never realized they were being studied by strangers sitting silently in nearby vehicles to them. The night remained ordinary, just another quiet stretch of hours before morning. But investigators who later examined the timeline would see this period very differently. They would recognize it as the moment when Ricky Davis and Dena O'Reilly's curiosity about human behavior began crossing into something more active, something more calculated. Because once observation turns into participation, the possibilities change, and the quiet partnership that had formed between them was now approaching a stage where ideas might begin transforming into actions with far more serious consequences. At this point in the story, however, those consequences had not yet fully emerged. The world around them still saw nothing more than scattered odd encounters and a pair of strangers traveling through the night. But beneath that ordinary surface, the pattern was growing clearer, that a pattern of escalating curiosity, of increasing confidence, and of two individuals who believed they were learning how to shape the situations they once only observed. Chapter 6: Inside the Mind. Control, Manipulation, and Influence. By the time Ricky Davis and Dena O'Reilly's nighttime activities had evolved from simple observation into cautious participation, something deeper had also begun changing within the psychology of their partnership. For months, their conversations had revolved around patterns, how people behaved, how routines created predictability, and how small disruptions could alter someone's reactions. But as those ideas became more ingrained in their thinking, the focus of their discussions began shifting toward a new subject: influence. The question was no longer just how people behaved. It had become something more complicated. How easily can people's behavior be influenced? Within the privacy of their late-night drives and long conversations, Ricky and Dena explored this idea with growing fascination. They talked about how quickly a situation could change when someone unexpected entered it, that a calm environment could become tense, that a routine interaction could become uncertain, and uncertainty, in their minds, created opportunity to them. Influence was not always about force or confrontation. Often, they believed it came from understanding the psychology of a moment, the tone of a voice, the way a question is asked, the timing of an approach. These small factors, they believed, could shape how people responded without those individuals even realizing it. Dena, in particular, seemed captivated by this concept. Those who had spoken with her during this period occasionally described her as someone who enjoyed analyzing human behavior almost like a puzzle. She spoke with confidence about how predictable people could be once their fears and expectations were understood. According to fragments of conversations later remembered by acquaintances, Dena sometimes described everyday interactions as scripts. Most people, she believed, followed familiar scripts without thinking about them. They reacted to situations the way they had always been taught. They trusted appearances. They expected certain social rules to apply. But what fascinated her most was what happened when those scripts were disrupted. When someone encountered a situation they did not expect, that moment of confusion, That brief pause where a person searched for the correct response was something she seemed to study with unusual attention. Ricky, meanwhile, appeared increasingly comfortable within this shared worldview. The quiet man who once kept his thoughts private had grown more engaged in these discussions. During their drives, he often expanded on Dena's ideas, describing how different environments might influence people's reactions. A crowded area created one set of expectations, an empty street created another, that a familiar place offered comfort, an unfamiliar one introduced uncertainty. Together, they analyzed how these factors shaped human decision-making. Their conversations sometimes resembled the discussions of amateur psychologists studying human behavior from a distance. But there was an important difference. They were not simply discussing theory. They were applying those ideas to the environments they explored during their nighttime drives. Each observation they made fed into their growing understanding of how people reacted under pressure. And the more they believed they understood these reactions, the more confident they became in their ability to influence them. Confidence, in situations like this, can be dangerous because it creates the illusion that complex human interactions can be controlled with simple strategies. For Ricky and Dena, this belief appeared to strengthen the bond between them. They increasingly viewed themselves as partners working toward the same understanding of the world. Two people who could read situations more clearly than others. Two people who could anticipate reactions before they occurred. That sense of shared insight became central to their relationship. The IT reinforced the idea that they were different from the people around them, more aware, more observant, more capable of navigating unpredictable situations. Meanwhile, their nighttime drives continued providing opportunities to test these ideas. They still visited quiet neighborhoods and nearly empty parking lots. But now their attention focused more closely on the moments when individuals seemed uncertain, that a driver looking around before entering a dark parking area, that a pedestrian hesitating while walking past an unfamiliar vehicle, that a person glancing over their shoulder after hearing an unexpected sound. These small reactions fascinated them because each one confirmed something they had been discussing for months, that people often rely on expectations to feel safe. And when those expectations are disrupted, their behavior can change dramatically. Dena often described these moments as windows into human psychology, moments when someone's instinctive reactions replaced their usual social confidence. For Ricky, the process seemed almost analytical, that he watched carefully, noting how long people hesitated, what direction they moved, and how quickly they attempted to restore a sense of normalcy. Together, they treated these observations almost like research, a growing collection of examples that supported their ideas about influence and control. But as these ideas became more central to their thinking, another shift was beginning to occur. The concept of influence was slowly merging with something else. Opportunity. That if a person could predict how someone would react in a moment of uncertainty, then it followed that situations could be shaped in ways that produced those reactions. First, this idea likely existed only in conversation, that a theoretical possibility discussed during long drives through quiet streets. But the more they talked about it, the more realistic it began to feel. After all, they had already spent months observing how people behaved in unfamiliar situations. They had watched hesitation appear in strangers' movements. They had seen uncertainty influence decisions. To them, it may have seemed like evidence that their ideas were correct. And with that belief came a growing curiosity about what might happen if those moments were not simply observed, but deliberately created. At this stage, those thoughts still remained mostly within conversation. But the psychology of the partnership had already shifted. They were no longer just studying human behavior. They were imagining how to shape it. And once that line begins to blur, the distance between observation and action can grow smaller than anyone expects. As Ricky Davis and Dena Riley continued exploring their ideas about human behavior, their partnership began developing an internal logic that reinforced nearly every belief they shared. Over time, that logic became the foundation of how they interpreted the world around them. What made their dynamic particularly powerful was the way each person validated the other's thinking. When one proposed an idea, the other expanded it. When one noticed a behavioral pattern, the other confirmed it. Together, they created a continuous cycle of reinforcement, a feedback loop where doubt rarely entered the conversation. In many relationships, disagreements and outside perspectives help balance extreme ideas. Friends, family members, or coworkers often introduce alternative viewpoints that challenge assumptions. But Ricky and Dena had gradually separated themselves from most of those influences. Their social world had narrowed almost entirely to the two of them, and inside that small world, their shared beliefs grew stronger with every conversation. During their late-night drives, they often revisited situations they had witnessed earlier. A person who hesitated while crossing an empty parking lot. A driver who seemed nervous while pulling into a dimly lit gas station. A pedestrian who instinctively stepped away when a car slowed nearby. Each moment became another piece of evidence supporting their understanding of human psychology. Dena frequently described these reactions as predictable. To her, fear and uncertainty were universal responses. Once someone experienced those emotions, she believed their choices became easier to anticipate. Ricky approached the idea more quietly, but no less seriously. He seemed particularly interested in the timing of reactions, how long it took someone to recognize something unusual, and how quickly they attempted to move away from it. During conversations recalled later by individuals who occasionally overheard fragments of their discussions, Ricky sometimes compared human reactions to patterns that could be measured, like observing how traffic flows through an intersection. Or how animals react to sudden movement in their environment. The comparison may have sounded unusual, but it revealed something important about the way he had begun viewing people, not as individuals with unpredictable personalities, but as participants in patterns that could be studied and anticipated. Dena's role in the partnership often involved translating those observations into broader conclusions. She spoke confidently about how easily people trusted appearances. If someone seemed calm, they assumed nothing was wrong. If a situation looked ordinary, they rarely questioned it. This belief fascinated her because it suggested that perception itself could be influenced. A person's sense of safety depended largely on what they expected to see. And when expectations were manipulated, reactions could change dramatically. These ideas remained theoretical for much of their discussions, but the more they talked about them, the more their curiosity appeared to grow. They began imagining scenarios where ordinary expectations might suddenly shift. A quiet street, interrupted by unexpected movement. A routine interaction disrupted by something unfamiliar. Moments when people would briefly lose their sense of certainty. For Ricky and Dena, those moments seemed almost like psychological experiments waiting to happen. Meanwhile, their nighttime drives continued, providing opportunities to observe these reactions in real environments. On several occasions, witnesses later remembered seeing their vehicle moving slowly through quiet neighborhoods before stopping at intersections or empty parking areas. Sometimes the car remained still for several minutes. Other times it moved again after only a brief pause. From the outside, these movements appeared random, but investigators reviewing the timeline years later noticed that the couple often returned to the same locations repeatedly, places where the environment allowed them to observe human behavior with minimal attention. Places where small disruptions might go unnoticed. One particularly telling detail emerged. During the reconstruction of these events, the couple appeared to favor locations where lighting conditions created pockets of shadow, areas where visibility changed from one step to the next, where a person might feel comfortable one moment and uncertain the next. These environments offered exactly the kind of psychological contrast that fascinated them, that a shift from light to darkness, from familiarity to uncertainty, from routine to unpredictability, that in their discussions, those contrasts seem to represent opportunities. Because when people encounter unexpected situations, their reactions often reveal instinct rather than careful thought. And instinctive reactions were exactly what Ricky and Dena believed they understood best. Over time, their shared belief in this understanding created a growing sense of confidence. Confidence that they could anticipate how situations would unfold. Confidence that they could navigate unfamiliar environments without attracting attention. Confidence that their observations had given them insights others lacked. This sense of confidence would later become one of the most important factors investigators considered when studying their partnership, because confidence can gradually remove the psychological barriers that prevent people from testing their ideas in the real world. The more convinced someone becomes that they understand a system, the more tempting it can be to push its limits. For Ricky and Dena, the line between curiosity and experimentation had already begun to blur. Their conversations no longer focused only on observing behavior. They increasingly explored the possibility of creating situations where those reactions might appear, situations where uncertainty could be introduced deliberately. And while these ideas may still have seemed abstract during many of their discussions, the psychological groundwork had already been laid. They believed they understood how people reacted. They believed they could predict moments of hesitation. And they believed those moments could be influenced. The next stage in their story would reveal what happens when such beliefs move beyond theory. Because once people become convinced that they understand how others will react, the temptation to test that understanding can become difficult to resist. And for Ricky Davis and Dena Riley, that temptation was quietly growing stronger with every passing night. Chapter 7. The investigation awakens. Detectives start connecting the dots. For a long time, the quiet disturbances scattered across different neighborhoods had existed only as isolated reports. Each incident had been handled individually, often by different officers responding to routine calls that seemed too minor to warrant further investigation, that a brief encounter between strangers, that a vehicle parked in unusual locations late at night, that a few reports of individuals asking strange questions before disappearing into the darkness of empty streets. None of these moments appeared serious enough to connect with one another. And yet, in many investigations, patterns only become visible after enough time has passed for someone to step back and examine the larger picture. In this case, that moment came when several reports from separate areas were quietly reviewed by a small group of detectives working through routine case files. First, the connection between the incidents was not obvious. The locations were spread across multiple neighborhoods. The descriptions provided by witnesses were vague and inconsistent, and the events themselves did not involve any clear crimes that demanded immediate attention. But something about the timing of the reports caught the attention of one investigator. Several of the incidents had occurred during the same late-night hours, between midnight and the early morning, the time of night when most streets fall silent and fewer people are awake to notice unusual activity. That detail alone was not enough to raise alarms. But as the investigator continued reviewing the reports, another similarity began to appear. Witnesses frequently mentioned a vehicle. The descriptions varied slightly, different estimates of color, different guesses about the type of car, but the basic pattern remained the same: a vehicle parked nearby, 2 individuals inside. Watching the surroundings carefully, in some cases the car drove away immediately after someone approached. In others it remained long enough for brief conversations to occur. On it first, the investigator simply noted the similarity and moved on. But curiosity has a way of returning to details that feel unfinished. Later that week, while reviewing another report from a different district, the same pattern appeared again. A car parked late at night. Two people inside. A short interaction with a stranger that ended abruptly. The officer handling that report had treated it as a minor disturbance, something unusual but not serious. But now, seeing the same elements repeated across multiple reports, the investigator began to wonder whether these events might share a common thread. Patterns rarely reveal themselves immediately. They emerge gradually, through careful comparison and patient observation. And once the idea of a connection entered the investigator's mind, the search for additional reports began. Within hours, several more incidents surfaced, each one small, each one seemingly harmless. But when placed together, they began forming a quiet timeline. Late-night encounters. Parked vehicles. Two individuals. Questions asked about the surrounding area. Sudden departures when attention increased. The pattern was subtle, but it was unmistakable. Someone, or perhaps two people, had been moving through multiple neighborhoods during the same hours, engaging in similar interactions with strangers. At this stage, investigators did not assume criminal intent. Strange behavior alone does not necessarily indicate wrongdoing. People travel at night for many reasons, and conversations with strangers, though unusual in quiet areas, can happen without any harmful purpose. Still, the pattern was unusual enough to justify further attention. Detectives began compiling the reports into a single file. Witness statements were compared. Dates were arranged in chronological order. And slowly, a map of the incidents began forming. What the map revealed was interesting. The locations did not cluster in one specific neighborhood. Instead, they formed a loose pattern across several areas connected by major roads. Someone had been moving between districts rather than staying in one place. This suggested a deliberate effort to avoid drawing attention within a single community. It also suggested that the individuals involved were familiar with the layout of the region. They knew how to travel quietly between neighborhoods without attracting notice. Investigators also noticed something else. The reports rarely involved the same witnesses twice. In other words, whoever was responsible appeared careful not to interact repeatedly with the same people. Each encounter was brief. Each one occurred in a different place, and each one ended quickly. This level of caution hinted at a certain awareness of how attention works. Stay in one place too long, and people begin to remember, move frequently, and memories remain scattered. For the detectives reviewing the case file, this pattern raised a new question. Were these simply unusual nighttime encounters? Or was someone deliberately studying the environments they were moving through? At that moment, the investigation remained in its earliest stage. No suspects had been identified. No crimes serious enough to trigger major alerts had occurred, and the individuals behind the pattern remained unknown. But one thing had changed. The scattered reports that once existed as unrelated incidents were now part of a single timeline. And that timeline suggested that someone had been quietly moving through the region for months, leaving behind faint traces of unusual behavior. For Ricky Davis and Dena Riley, however, the growing attention from investigators remained completely invisible. Their late-night drives continued. Their conversations about human behavior grew more confident, and their belief that they could move unnoticed through unfamiliar environments appeared stronger than ever. They had spent months observing how people reacted to uncertainty. What they did not yet realize was that someone else had begun observing them. Once investigators began assembling the scattered reports into a single timeline, the atmosphere surrounding the case changed almost immediately. What had once appeared to be unrelated incidents now formed a quiet network of observations stretching across several districts. The individual details were still small, that a vehicle seen late at night point to individuals inside, short conversations with strangers, moments of watchful observation before quickly driving away. None of those details alone suggested anything alarming. But together, they hinted at something more deliberate. For detectives accustomed to looking for patterns, the repetition was difficult to ignore. The next step in their process involved mapping the incidents geographically. Using the reports collected from multiple precincts, investigators placed markers on a regional map representing each location where unusual activity had been reported. At first, the pattern looked random. The incidents were scattered across different neighborhoods, with no clear center point connecting them. But as more reports were added to the map, a subtle structure began to appear. The locations seemed to follow major roadways, not the busiest highways, but secondary routes that allowed someone to travel quietly between districts without drawing attention. This discovery suggested something important. Whoever was responsible for the late-night encounters appeared to be moving with intention. They were not staying in one area. They were traveling, moving through different environments, observing each one briefly before continuing to the next. For investigators, this raised a new possibility. Perhaps the individuals involved were not simply wandering. Perhaps they were studying the areas they visited. To test this idea, detectives began examining the timeline more closely. They looked at the days of the week when incidents occurred, the time of night they were reported, and the types of locations involved. Another pattern soon emerged. Most encounters took place between midnight and 3 in the morning. These hours offered the lowest levels of pedestrian activity and reduced traffic flow. In other words, they were the hours when unusual behavior would attract the least attention. The locations themselves also shared certain characteristics. Many were areas with limited lighting. Others were commercial districts that closed early, leaving empty parking lots and quiet streets after dark. These environments created pockets of isolation, places where brief interactions could occur without many witnesses nearby. For investigators, this suggested a level of awareness about how environments influence visibility. Someone moving through these locations appeared to understand how attention works, where people are most likely to notice something unusual and where they are least likely to see it at all. At this stage, detectives still lacked a clear description of the individuals involved. Witness accounts varied too widely to produce accurate sketches. Some described a dark-colored vehicle, while others remembered a lighter one. Some believed the occupants were younger. Others thought they appeared older, but one detail appeared repeatedly in the reports. There were always two people, a man and a woman. Sometimes the woman spoke first during conversations, sometimes the man did. But witnesses consistently recalled the presence of both individuals inside the vehicle. This detail narrowed the possibilities slightly. While two people traveling together at night was not unusual, the repeated pattern suggested a partnership. Two individuals working together in ways that remained unclear. As detectives continued reviewing reports, they also began reaching out to officers who had originally handled the incidents. Many of those officers remembered the encounters only vaguely. After all, none of the situations had involved serious crimes, but a few details from those conversations proved useful. Several officers recalled that the individuals involved seemed calm during interactions with witnesses. They did not appear nervous. They did not rush away immediately unless someone approached too closely. Instead, they often engaged in brief conversation before leaving. This behavior suggested confidence. And confidence, investigators knew, often comes from familiarity with a routine. People rarely repeat unusual behavior across multiple locations unless they feel comfortable doing so. That realization introduced a new concern that if the individuals behind these encounters had been moving through the region for months without attracting attention, they may have grown confident in their ability to remain unnoticed. Confidence can lead to escalation. And escalation, investigators knew, could eventually produce more serious incidents. Because of this possibility, detectives began quietly increasing awareness among patrol units in several districts. Officers were advised to note any reports involving vehicles parked in unusual locations during late night hours. They were asked to document interactions with strangers who appeared to be asking unusual questions about neighborhoods or local routines. The instructions were subtle. There was no public alert, no announcement suggesting a serious threat. At this stage, investigators simply wanted more information, more observations, more details that might help identify the individuals moving through these quiet nighttime environments. Meanwhile, Ricky Davis and Dena Riley continued following the patterns they had developed over the previous months. Their late-night drives still felt like private explorations of the world around them. They believed their movements were invisible. They believed the small interactions they initiated would be forgotten by morning. And for the most part, those assumptions had been correct, until now, because somewhere within the network of police reports and quiet investigations, their pattern had begun to take shape. The scattered encounters they left behind were no longer isolated. They were connected, examined, and slowly forming a trail that investigators would continue following. At this stage, Ricky and Dena still moved freely through the night, unaware that their actions had begun drawing attention, but the quiet advantage they once believed they had was beginning to fade, because once investigators start recognizing patterns, even the smallest details can eventually lead to answers. Chapter 8: Living Double Lives. Normal Appearances, Dark Secrets. To the people who occasionally crossed paths with Ricky Davis and Dena Riley during the day, nothing about their lives appeared unusual. In the quiet rhythm of everyday routines, they blended into the background of ordinary life almost perfectly. They visited stores. They spoke politely to clerks. They moved through public spaces with the same calm presence that most people display during routine errands. If someone had asked neighbors or casual acquaintances about the couple, the answers would likely have been simple. They seemed quiet. They mostly kept to themselves. Nothing really stood out. That ability to appear ordinary would later become one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. Because while their daytime lives followed predictable routines, the hours after midnight told a very different story. During daylight, Ricky and Dena rarely attracted attention, but Ricky's naturally reserved demeanor made him easy to overlook in public settings. He spoke softly, avoided unnecessary conversations, and carried himself with a calmness that often made people assume he was simply introverted. Dena, by contrast, projected a slightly stronger presence. She was more likely to initiate brief conversations with strangers or express opinions during discussions. But even then, her behavior rarely crossed into anything suspicious to most people. They appeared like any other couple navigating everyday life together. Yet the contrast between those daytime routines and their nighttime activities was becoming increasingly sharp. Investigators quietly expanded their review of reports across different districts. They began noticing something interesting about the timeline of events. Nearly every encounter involving the mysterious late-night vehicle occurred during hours when most people were asleep, between midnight and 3 in the morning. During the day, there were almost no reports connected to the pattern. This suggested that whoever was responsible had deliberately chosen a schedule that separated their unusual behavior from their normal routines. For Ricky and Dena, that separation may have made their actions feel safer. Daytime represented normalcy. Nighttime represented experimentation. Two different worlds that rarely overlapped. And because the majority of people they interacted with during daylight hours never saw their nighttime behavior, the illusion of an ordinary life remained intact. The psychology of living such double lives can be complex. Maintaining two different identities requires careful attention to boundaries. One set of behaviors must never interfere with the other. For Ricky and Dena, this appeared to come naturally. They understood how to move through ordinary environments without drawing attention. They knew how to speak casually with strangers, and they rarely revealed anything about the conversations or ideas that occupied their late-night drives. Those discussions remained private, confined to the quiet interior of their car as it moved through empty streets. Meanwhile, investigators were beginning to notice subtle connections between the locations visited by the mysterious vehicle and the broader geography of the region. Many of the areas where encounters occurred were places that could be reached quickly from several different neighborhoods, roads that allowed someone to enter quietly and leave just as easily. This suggested familiarity with the layout of the surrounding districts. Whoever was traveling these routes likely knew them well. For detectives examining the map of incidents, this raised an important question. Were the individuals responsible local residents, or were they simply passing through from elsewhere? At this stage, there was not enough evidence to answer that question. But investigators began focusing more closely on the possibility that the individuals involved might live somewhere within the region. If that were true, then their daytime routines might look perfectly normal to the people around them. Just another couple living an ordinary life. The thought was unsettling, because it meant the people responsible for months of unusual nighttime encounters could be anyone. A neighbor. A coworker. Someone seen casually during daily errands. Meanwhile, Ricky and Dena continued their routines without any indication that attention was slowly forming around their pattern of behavior. During the day, they remained calm and unremarkable. During the night, they returned to the familiar rhythm of long drives through quiet neighborhoods. And as their confidence grew, their discussions about influence and control continued evolving. They spoke often about how easily appearances shape people's expectations. That if something looks normal, most individuals never question it. If a person behaves calmly, others assume there is nothing to fear. This belief reinforced the strategy that had allowed them to move unnoticed for so long. Appear ordinary, speak casually, leave quickly if attention grows. It was a simple formula, and for months, it had worked. But what Ricky and Dena did not realize was that the small encounters they left behind, the questions asked, the locations visited, the brief observations made by witnesses, were slowly accumulating into something larger. Investigators were beginning to see the pattern, and as the timeline expanded, detectives were moving closer to understanding the individuals behind it. Still, the contrast between the couple's two worlds remained striking. In daylight, they were just another quiet pair moving through everyday routines. But after dark, the same individuals became participants in a series of encounters that investigators were now studying with increasing interest. Two lives. Two identities, separated by the turning of the clock, and while the illusion of normalcy still held strong, the growing investigation meant that those worlds would eventually begin to collide. As Ricky Davis and Dena Riley continued moving between their quiet daytime routines and their increasingly purposeful nighttime drives, the contrast between those two lives became more pronounced. During the day, the couple maintained the same calm, almost unremarkable presence that had always allowed them to blend easily into the background of ordinary life. They followed routines that looked familiar to anyone observing from the outside: short errands, occasional conversations with people in stores, moments of normal interaction that revealed nothing about the long discussions that occupied their late nights. If someone encountered them during these hours, there would have been no reason to suspect anything unusual. But the hours after midnight continued shaping a very different rhythm. The couple's late night drives were no longer just about wandering through quiet streets. By now, they had begun returning repeatedly to certain locations that had captured their attention during earlier observations. Places where human behavior seemed especially predictable: parking lots that emptied quickly after closing hours, quiet residential streets where activity slowed dramatically late at night, commercial districts that offered long stretches of darkness once businesses shut their doors. These environments fascinated them because they provided something their conversations had always revolved around: contrast, light and shadow, movement and stillness, confidence and hesitation. In these places, the reactions they had studied for months appeared most clearly, and with each return visit, the couple seemed more comfortable navigating these environments. Witness accounts later reviewed by investigators suggested that their vehicle often moved slowly through these areas, sometimes pausing briefly before continuing down the road. From the outside, such behavior could easily be mistaken for someone searching for an address or waiting for a friend. Yet the repeated nature of these movements suggested something more deliberate. Ricky and Dena appeared to be revisiting locations where they had previously observed moments of uncertainty among strangers, moments when individuals hesitated, moments when people seemed unsure about their surroundings. For the couple, these locations represented opportunities to continue studying those reactions. Meanwhile, investigators had begun quietly expanding their efforts to gather more information about the mysterious nighttime encounters. Officers patrolling several districts had been asked to remain alert for vehicles parked in unusual places during the early morning hours. Particular attention was given to reports involving two individuals traveling together, as so far. However, the information gathered remained incomplete. Witness descriptions of the vehicle varied too widely to produce a clear identification. Some believed it was a dark sedan. Others thought it might have been a light-colored compact car. Lighting conditions at night made accurate details difficult to capture. Still, one detail continued appearing consistently: two occupants, a man and a woman, often sitting quietly in the vehicle before briefly interacting with someone nearby or leaving the area entirely. Detectives reviewing these reports noticed something else as well. The couple rarely remained in any one location for very long. Their pattern involved movement, arriving quietly, observing, leaving before too much attention developed. This strategy made it difficult for patrol officers to encounter them directly. By the time a report reached authorities, the vehicle was usually long gone. For Ricky and Dena, this pattern likely reinforced their belief that they were moving unnoticed through the world. Their experiences seemed to confirm the ideas they had discussed for months. People rarely pay attention to what they are not expecting to see. That if a car sits quietly in a parking lot, most passers-by assume it belongs there. If two people ask casual questions during a late-night conversation, the interaction is often forgotten quickly. Appear ordinary, act calm, leave before suspicion grows. These simple principles continued guiding the couple's movements through unfamiliar areas, and for a while, they worked. Yet the accumulation of small encounters across different districts was slowly narrowing the gap between their confidence and the reality, forming behind the scenes. Because investigators had begun mapping those encounters carefully, each new report added another point to the growing timeline, another location connected to the pattern. Another clue about the routes the mysterious vehicles seemed to follow. Slowly, detectives began identifying certain roads that appeared repeatedly in the reports. These roads linked several of the neighborhoods where encounters had occurred. Anyone traveling along those routes could easily move between districts without using heavily monitored highways. This discovery suggested that the individuals behind the pattern were not wandering randomly. They were following familiar paths that allowed them to navigate quietly through multiple areas during the same night. For investigators, this realization strengthened the belief that the individuals involved likely lived somewhere within the region. Someone familiar with these roads, someone comfortable driving them repeatedly during late night. Hours at the same time, Ricky and Dena continued living the quiet double life that had defined their partnership for months. During daylight, nothing about their behavior hinted at the growing attention their nighttime activities had begun attracting. Neighbors still saw them occasionally. Acquaintances who spoke with them noticed nothing alarming. The calm exterior they presented remained intact, but beneath that ordinary appearance, the patterns they had created were slowly drawing investigators closer to understanding who they were. Every encounter left a trace. Every movement across districts added another detail to the map forming in detectives' offices. And though Ricky and Dena still believed their actions remained invisible, the two lives they had carefully separated were beginning to move toward the same point at a moment when the quiet observations of investigators would finally intersect with the quiet movements of the couple themselves. Chapter 9. The net tightens. Evidence begins to surface. By the time investigators had compiled months of scattered reports into a single timeline, the case had quietly shifted from curiosity into something far more serious. What once looked like isolated incidents across several neighborhoods was now clearly part of a pattern, one that suggested two individuals had been moving deliberately through the region during the quietest hours of the night. For detectives studying the case, the challenge was no longer recognizing the pattern. The challenge was identifying the people behind it. Patterns in human behavior often leave subtle traces. A route chosen repeatedly, a time of night favored for activity, or the type of location someone returns to again and again can reveal far more than the individuals themselves might realize. And as investigators began reviewing the timeline more carefully, those traces slowly started pointing towards something tangible. One of the first breakthroughs came from a seemingly ordinary report filed weeks earlier by a patrol officer responding to a minor disturbance. At the time, the officer had spoken briefly with a witness who described a car parked near a closed storefront late at night. The witness had not considered the moment significant. The vehicle simply appeared out of place in an otherwise empty parking area. But the witness had remembered something interesting. The car had driven past slowly earlier in the evening before returning nearly 30 minutes later at the time. The officer recorded the observation and moved on. No crime had occurred, and the occupants of the vehicle had left before anyone could speak with them. But now, months later, investigators reviewing the report realized the detail mattered. Returning to the same location within a short period suggested the individuals inside the vehicle were not simply passing through. They were revisiting places they had already observed. This detail aligned closely with the pattern detectives had begun identifying across other reports. Certain locations appeared more than once in the timeline. The couple had returned to them repeatedly, perhaps because they believed those environments offered something valuable, quiet spaces where people behaved predictably. With this idea in mind, detectives began reviewing additional reports from the same locations, and slowly, new fragments of information began to appear. Another witness remembered a vehicle that had paused briefly near a dimly lit intersection before continuing down the road. At a different report described two individuals sitting in a parked car, while watching activity near a small convenience store. None of these observations provided enough detail to identify the people involved, but they did begin revealing something about the vehicle itself. Witnesses consistently described a relatively small car, not a large truck or SUV, something lower to the ground, easy to maneuver through narrow streets, easy to park quietly without drawing attention. Investigators also noticed that the vehicle was almost always described as moving slowly, deliberately, as though the driver were carefully studying the surroundings. For detectives trained to analyze behavior patterns, this detail was important. Someone driving slowly through unfamiliar neighborhoods late at night was not simply traveling from one destination to another. They were observing, watching, learning the environment. The next step in the investigation involved reviewing traffic camera footage from several intersections located near the reported encounters. Most cameras covering residential areas during late-night hours captured very little activity. Hours could pass without a single vehicle appearing on screen, but occasionally a car would pass through the frame. And when investigators compared the timestamps of those recordings with the reported encounters, something interesting began to appear. That a small sedan passed through several intersections within minutes of the times witnesses had reported unusual activity nearby. The vehicle appeared only briefly in the footage before disappearing into the darkness of connecting streets. The camera quality was not high enough to capture a license plate, but the shape of the vehicle was consistent across several recordings. That a compact sedan, light-colored, moving slowly. And in at least one recording, investigators believed they could see two occupants inside. For the first time, the investigation had something tangible. That a vehicle connected to multiple points along the timeline. That IT was not yet proof of wrongdoing, but it was a starting point. Detectives began cataloging every appearance of that vehicle across available camera recordings. They mapped its movements across several districts, and what they discovered reinforced the pattern they had suspected for weeks. The car was traveling along the same network of secondary roads that investigators had already identified through witness reports. That IT entered quiet neighborhoods, remained in the area for short periods, then moved on to another district. The movements were cautious, almost methodical, and the routes suggested someone familiar with the layout of the region, someone who knew which roads allowed quick movement between neighborhoods without passing through heavily monitored areas. Meanwhile, Ricky Davis and Dena O'Reilly continued their nighttime drives completely unaware that their movements had begun appearing on investigative maps and camera recordings that TO them. The world still felt invisible. The quiet streets still seemed empty. Their conversations about human behavior continued as if nothing had changed, but behind the scenes, the small details they had left behind, witness observations, camera footage, repeated routes across districts, were slowly tightening the net around them. Because every investigation begins with fragments, and once those fragments begin forming a clear picture, the search for answers becomes far more focused. Once investigators had identified the compact sedan appearing in multiple camera recordings, the direction of the investigation began to shift. What had once been a collection of witness statements and scattered observations was slowly becoming a clearer trail. The vehicle itself was not unique. Thousands of similar cars traveled through the region every day. At first glance, identifying one specific vehicle among them seemed nearly impossible, but detectives were not relying on a single piece of evidence. They were building a pattern, and patterns often reveal more than individual details ever could. The first step involved reviewing traffic camera footage from additional intersections along the routes investigators believed the vehicle had traveled. While many residential cameras captured only occasional movement late at night, the team focused on intersections where major secondary roads connected multiple neighborhoods. These intersections acted like gateways between districts. Anyone moving quietly through the region during the late hours would almost certainly pass through them. Hours of footage were reviewed. Most of it revealed nothing unusual, but eventually, the same compact sedan began appearing again. The car entered one neighborhood. Shortly after midnight, it remained in the area for roughly 20 minutes. Then it reappeared at another intersection several miles away. The pattern repeated across several nights. The vehicle moved slowly through one district, disappeared for a short period, then surfaced again somewhere else. For detectives studying the timeline, the movements suggested a deliberate strategy. The driver was not traveling directly from one place to another. Instead, the vehicle followed a looping path across multiple neighborhoods before eventually leaving the area. This raised an important question. Where did the vehicle start its journey, and where did it end? If investigators could answer that question, they might identify the individuals responsible for months of unusual encounters that do that. Detectives began tracing the earliest and latest appearances of the sedan within each night's camera recordings in several cases. The vehicle seemed to enter the network of neighborhoods from the same direction. A quiet road connecting a cluster of residential communities on the outskirts of the region. It was not a major highway, just a modest road lined with houses and small apartment complexes. But it connected easily to the secondary routes the vehicle appeared to use during its nighttime drives. This discovery narrowed the search considerably. Instead of looking across the entire region, investigators could now focus their attention on a smaller area where the vehicle likely originated: patrol. Units were quietly asked to observe traffic in those neighborhoods during late-night hours. There was no immediate attempt to stop vehicles or question drivers. Instead, officers simply documented cars moving through the area between midnight and 3 in the morning. The goal was to see whether the compact sedan might appear again. Meanwhile, detectives continued studying the timeline of the vehicle's movements across previous weeks. The more they examined the routes, the clearer the pattern became. The car rarely stayed in one place for more than 30 minutes. It moved methodically from one district to another, and it often followed the same looping route before eventually returning toward the residential area investigators had begun focusing on. Whoever was driving that vehicle appeared comfortable navigating these roads in the dark. They knew which streets were quiet, which areas had minimal traffic during late hours, which routes allowed quick movement between neighborhoods. In other words, they were familiar with the region, very familiar. For Ricky Davis and Dena Riley, however, the idea that investigators were studying these movements would have seemed almost impossible. Their experiences during months of nighttime drives had reinforced the belief that no one was paying attention. Witnesses rarely remembered them clearly. Encounters with strangers were brief, and quiet streets often appeared completely empty. The illusion of invisibility had been one of the strongest elements supporting their confidence. But what they had not considered was how small fragments of information accumulate over time. One witness noticing a parked car. Another remembering a brief conversation. A traffic camera capturing a passing vehicle. Each detail seemed insignificant alone, but when combined, they began forming a picture investigators were now studying carefully. The next stage of the investigation involved identifying vehicles within the residential area where detectives believed the sedan might originate. Records of registered vehicles matching the general description were quietly reviewed. The list was not short. Many residents owned cars similar to the ones seen in the footage, but investigators did not need to examine them all. They only needed to focus on vehicles that appeared active during the same late-night hours connected to the timeline. Officers began documenting cars leaving and returning to the area between midnight and early morning. Night after night, they watched quietly, waiting, observing, looking for the compact sedan that had already appeared across multiple camera recordings. And while the investigation continued unfolding quietly behind the scenes, Ricky Davis and Dena Riley remained unaware that the patterns guiding their nighttime drives had already begun guiding investigators toward them. The routes they believed kept them invisible were now the same routes detectives were studying most closely, and with every new observation, the gap between the couple and the investigation was slowly narrowing. Because once investigators identify a pattern, the next step is only a matter of time, finding the people behind it. Chapter 10: Confrontation. The moment investigators closed in, by the time investigators had spent weeks quietly observing traffic patterns in the residential area connected to the compact sedan, the atmosphere surrounding the case had grown far more focused. What had once been an uncertain investigation built from scattered reports was now centered on a single objective: identify the vehicle, identify the people inside it, and determine why they had spent months moving through the region during the quietest hours of the night. Detectives understood that patience would be essential. Someone who had successfully avoided attention for so long was unlikely to suddenly reveal themselves through careless behavior. Instead, the investigation moved slowly, quietly. Night after night, patrol units monitored the roads leading out of the residential district investigators believed to be connected to the sedan's movements. Most evenings passed without incident. Cars occasionally came and went, but none matched the exact pattern detectives had been studying. But then, shortly after midnight, on a calm weekday night, a patrol officer positioned along one of the connecting roads noticed something familiar. The compact sedan turned slowly onto the street. The vehicle's shape matched the one investigators had seen repeatedly in traffic camera footage. Its light color reflected faintly beneath the dim glow of a street lamp. The officer watched carefully as the car passed point. Two occupants sat inside. The officer did not stop the vehicle. Instead, they radioed the observation to the investigative team that had been monitoring the case. Within minutes, additional officers positioned along nearby roads quietly prepared to observe the car's movements. The goal was not immediate confrontation. Investigators wanted to confirm whether the vehicle followed the same routes that had appeared in earlier reports. The sedan continued moving slowly through the quiet neighborhood before turning onto one of the secondary roads detectives had already identified as part of the pattern for investigators. Listening over the radio, the moment was significant. The route matched their expectations almost exactly. The vehicle was heading toward the same network of districts where previous encounters had been reported. From a distance, officers followed carefully. They kept several blocks between themselves and the sedan, making sure not to attract attention. The last thing investigators wanted was to alert the occupants that they were being watched. As the vehicle moved deeper into the road network, connecting multiple neighborhoods, the pattern became unmistakable. The car slowed near several locations where witnesses had previously reported unusual encounters. Parking areas, dim intersections, quiet commercial streets that eye in each place. The sedan paused briefly before continuing. The movements were cautious, measured, almost identical to the behavior described in months of earlier reports. For detectives observing the vehicle's path through radio updates, the moment felt like watching the investigation's entire timeline unfold in real time. All the pieces they had studied, the routes, the locations, the timing, were appearing exactly as expected, but the most important question still remained unanswered. Who were the individuals inside the car? For nearly an hour, officers continued following from a distance while documenting the vehicle's movements. The sedan eventually returned toward the same residential area where it had first appeared. As it approached the neighborhood, Investigators decided the moment had come to identify the occupants. Two patrol cars positioned themselves along the quiet street the vehicle was approaching. Their lights remained off. The goal was simply to observe the car as it passed and gather identifying details. The sedan turned onto the street. For a brief moment, it passed directly beneath a street lamp. The light illuminated the vehicle clearly enough for officers to see inside. A man was driving. A woman sat in the passenger seat. Both appeared calm. Neither showed any sign that they suspected they were being watched. As the car passed, officers recorded the license plate. Within minutes, the information was relayed back to investigators monitoring the case. The plate was registered to a vehicle owned by a local resident and an address within the same neighborhood where detectives had been focusing their attention for the first time in the investigation. The mysterious vehicle was connected to a specific location, a specific name. The moment represented a major turning point. Months of quiet observation had finally produced a direct lead. But detectives knew the investigation was far from over. Identifying the vehicle's owner was only the beginning. They still needed to understand the role those individuals played in the strange pattern of nighttime encounters that had drawn investigators' attention, and that would require patience, careful observation, and a deeper look into the lives of the two people who had spent so many nights traveling through the quiet streets of the region. Inside the sedan, however, Ricky Davis and Dena Riley continued their drive, unaware that the illusion of invisibility they had relied on for so long had finally begun to disappear. Because for the first time, investigators were no longer studying a mystery, they were studying them. Once investigators had successfully recorded the license plate of the compact sedan, the investigation entered an entirely new phase. For months, detectives had been studying patterns without knowing who was responsible for them. Now, at last, the mystery vehicle had been connected to a specific registration. Within minutes of receiving the plate information, officers ran the number through the regional vehicle database. The results confirmed that the car belonged to a resident living within the same quiet neighborhood investigators had already been watching for the detectives involved in the case. The discovery felt both exciting and cautious at the same time. After months of uncertainty, they finally had a name connected to the vehicle, but identifying the owner of a car was only the beginning of understanding the situation. Investigators needed to proceed carefully to this stage. There was still no direct evidence linking the occupants of the vehicle to any serious crime. The pattern of unusual nighttime activity was suspicious, but it did not yet justify immediate arrests or public accusations. Instead, the next step involved something detectives often rely on when trying to understand a developing case: surveillance. Over the following days, investigators quietly began gathering more information about the individuals connected to the sedan. Records confirmed that the vehicle was associated with an address in the residential area where the car had been observed. Leaving late at night, the address belonged to Ricky Davis, and records indicated that another adult resident, Dena Riley, lived at the same location. For investigators who had been studying reports involving two occupants inside the sedan, the discovery immediately aligned with witness descriptions. A man, a woman, traveling together, moving through neighborhoods during late-night hours. But detectives still needed to confirm whether the individuals connected to the vehicle were the same people involved in the unusual encounters reported across the region. Surveillance began quietly. Officers positioned themselves in unmarked vehicles along streets near the residence. Their goal was simple: observe, document, confirm patterns. During the day, the house appeared completely ordinary. Neighbors moved through their routines. Cars passed occasionally along the quiet street. Nothing about the residence suggested unusual activity. But investigators were not interested in daylight hours. They were waiting for the same time frame that had appeared again and again in the timeline of reports. Midnight, the early hours of the morning. Several nights passed without any significant movement. The sedan remained parked outside the residence. Lights inside the house went dark early in the evening. Everything appeared calm. But then, just after midnight on the fourth night of surveillance, investigators finally saw the pattern return. The front door of the house opened. Two individuals stepped outside. Even from a distance, detectives could see the same pairing witnesses had described in their reports: a man, a woman. They entered the compact sedan. The engine started quietly, and the vehicle pulled away from the curb. For investigators watching from a distance, the moment confirmed something important. The people connected to the vehicle were indeed active during the same late-night hours that had defined the entire timeline of incidents. Officers followed carefully from several blocks away. The strategy remained the same as before: no confrontation, no sudden stops, simply observation. And as the sedan began moving through the network of secondary roads connecting several neighborhoods, investigators watched the same pattern unfold once again. The vehicle slowed near familiar locations, paused briefly near areas where earlier witness reports had originated, then continued along the route. For detectives who had spent weeks studying those movements on maps and reports, the moment was unmistakable. The individuals connected to the residence were following the exact same path that had appeared across months of investigation. At this stage, investigators had enough information to justify a more direct approach. But rather than confronting the couple immediately during one of their drives, detectives chose a safer and more controlled moment. They waited. They gathered additional documentation of the vehicle's movements. They confirmed the pattern across several nights, and once they were confident, they had enough evidence linking the sedan to the unusual activity across multiple districts, the decision was made to approach the situation directly. The confrontation itself would not take place on a dark street during one of the couple's drives. Instead, investigators planned to speak with Ricky Davis and Dena Riley at their residence, a controlled environment, a place where officers could ask questions and determine what role the pair might have played in the strange series of encounters that had unfolded across the region. As dawn approached on the morning after the final night of surveillance, detectives prepared the next step in the investigation. Because after months of studying shadows, patterns, and scattered witness accounts, they were finally ready to confront the people behind them. Inside the quiet house at the end of the residential street, Ricky Davis and Dena Riley had no idea that their carefully maintained double life had reached its final turning point. The investigators, who had spent months following their movements, were now standing only a few steps away from answers. Chapter 11. Inside the interrogation: motives, truth, and the psychological unraveling. By the time investigators prepared to speak directly with Ricky Davis and Dena Riley, the case had quietly evolved from scattered observations into something far more structured. Months earlier, detectives had been dealing with little more than fragments, isolated reports, unclear witness descriptions, and unusual encounters that seemed too minor to attract serious attention. Now those fragments formed a clear timeline: late-night movements across several districts, a compact sedan traveling predictable routes, witnesses consistently describing two individuals inside the vehicle, and surveillance confirming that the same pair living within the residential neighborhood. Investigators had been monitoring were indeed following those exact patterns during the same hours. But even with that information in hand, detectives approached the situation cautiously. At this stage, the goal was not confrontation in the dramatic sense often portrayed in movies. Instead, Investigators hoped to understand what exactly Ricky and Dena had been doing during those long nighttime drives. Because unusual behavior does not always equal criminal intent. People explore cities at night for many reasons. Some simply enjoy quiet roads. Others wander without clear purpose. And although the patterns surrounding the couple's movements were suspicious, detectives still needed answers before drawing conclusions. The decision was made to approach the pair during daylight hours. Morning offered a calmer environment, a time when emotions were less likely to escalate and conversations could unfold without the tension of nighttime encounters. Point two investigators arrived at the residence shortly after mid-morning. The neighborhood itself appeared peaceful. Sunlight illuminated the quiet street where the compact sedan sat parked along the curb, looking no different from any other vehicle in the area. To a passerby, the house looked completely ordinary. Nothing about it suggested that it had been the starting point for months of mysterious nighttime activity. When the investigators knocked on the door, there was a brief pause before footsteps approached from inside. The door opened slowly. Standing there was Ricky Davis. From the detective's perspective, the man in front of them matched the calm demeanor witnesses had described during their encounters. He appeared composed, quiet, curious about the unexpected visitors, but not immediately alarmed. The investigators introduced themselves politely and explained that they were following up on a series of unusual reports connected to late-night activity in several districts nearby. They asked if he would be willing to answer a few questions. For a moment, Ricky seemed surprised, but after a brief hesitation, he agreed. Inside the house, the environment looked exactly as investigators might expect in any ordinary home. Furniture arranged neatly, light filtering through windows, nothing that suggested the kind of secret life investigators had been studying. Dena Riley soon joined the conversation as well. She appeared calm, though her expression carried a hint of curiosity about why detectives were asking questions about nighttime activity. The investigators began with simple topics. Had the couple been driving late at night recently? Did they spend time traveling through different neighborhoods after midnight? The answers they received were cautious but straightforward. Yes, they sometimes drove late at night. They enjoyed quiet roads. They liked exploring different parts of the city when traffic was low. From a surface perspective, these explanations sounded reasonable. Many people enjoy nighttime drives for exactly those reasons. But the investigators continued gently guiding the conversation toward more specific details. They asked about the particular neighborhoods where witness reports had occurred, the parking lots, the intersections, the commercial areas where the sedan had been seen pausing for extended periods. This was the moment when the atmosphere inside the room began to shift slightly. Not dramatically, but enough for experienced detectives to notice. Ricky remained mostly quiet while Dena responded to many of the questions. She explained that they enjoyed observing the atmosphere of different places at night. She described it as a way to escape the routine of daily life. Quiet streets felt peaceful. Empty parking lots offered space to think that someone unfamiliar with the investigation. The explanation might have sounded poetic, but investigators knew the timeline too well. They knew how often the vehicle had returned to specific locations. They knew how frequently witnesses had described the couple asking questions about local activity or observing people nearby. The detectives continued asking questions, not accusatory ones, just calm requests for clarification. Why did they return to certain areas repeatedly? Why pause near the same locations where witnesses remembered seeing them? Watching the surroundings for the first time, Ricky spoke more directly. He explained that they were simply curious about how different environments felt at night. Some neighborhoods seemed quiet. Others felt uneasy. He described it as an interest in understanding how people behave when fewer others are around. The investigators exchanged brief glances. because that explanation aligned almost perfectly with the psychological themes they had suspected for months. Observation, human, behavior, reactions to unfamiliar environments. But there was still a deeper question that needed to be answered. What exactly had they intended to do with that understanding? And as the conversation continued, detectives began exploring that question carefully. Because sometimes the most important moments in an investigation occur not through dramatic revelations, but through quiet conversations where the truth slowly begins to surface. As the conversation inside the quiet house continued, the tone remained calm, almost conversational. The investigators had not arrived with raised voices or dramatic accusations. Instead, they relied on a technique that experienced detectives often use when confronting situations built on patterns rather than clear crimes. They listened, they asked simple questions, and they allowed the individuals they were speaking with to explain their own behavior. For Ricky Davis and Dena Riley, the questions at first seemed manageable. Their explanations remained consistent with what they had already described. They enjoyed driving at night. They were curious about the atmosphere of different neighborhoods. They liked observing how people behaved when the streets were quiet. That on the surface, those answers sounded reasonable. Nighttime exploration is not uncommon, and curiosity about human behavior is hardly unusual. But the investigators guiding the conversation knew something the couple did not fully realize. They already understood the pattern of those drives in remarkable detail. The detectives had maps showing the routes the sedan followed across several districts. They had witness statements describing the car parked near specific locations. They had traffic camera footage capturing the vehicle passing through intersections at precise times. Rather than challenging the explanations directly, the investigators began introducing small pieces of that information into the conversation. They mentioned a parking lot near a closed storefront where the car had been seen lingering. They referred to an intersection where witnesses recalled two people inside a vehicle carefully watching the street. They described the commercial district where the sedan had paused multiple times late at night. Each detail was presented calmly, almost casually, but with every new example, the scope of what investigators knew became clearer. For a brief moment, silence settled across the room. That it was not the tense silence of confrontation, but something quieter, the silence of realization. Because Ricky and Dena were beginning to understand that their nighttime movements, the ones they believed had gone unnoticed for months, had actually been observed from multiple angles. Witnesses, traffic cameras, patrol officers. Slowly, the illusion of invisibility they had relied upon was fading. Dena was the first to respond. She explained again that they had never intended to harm anyone. Their interest in observing people, she said, had grown out of long discussions about psychology and human behavior. They had become fascinated with how different environments influenced the way individuals reacted. Why someone might feel confident walking down a brightly lit street, but uneasy in a darker area. Why people often hesitate when confronted with something unexpected. She described their late-night drives almost like research, a way to see those reactions in real life. The investigators listened carefully. Then one of them asked a simple follow-up question: that if the goal had only been observation, why approach strangers? Why ask questions about local routines? Why remain parked in places where people later reported feeling watched? The question lingered for a moment before Ricky spoke again. His voice remained calm, but his answer revealed something deeper about the mindset investigators had suspected all along. That he explained that observation alone sometimes felt incomplete. Watching behavior from a distance was interesting, but it did not always reveal how people reacted when situations changed. Sometimes they had asked questions simply to see how someone would respond. Other times they approached briefly to understand how individuals reacted when something unexpected occurred nearby. In other words, Their curiosity had gradually shifted from passive observation to small experiments. They wanted to see reactions. They wanted to test their ideas about human behavior in real situations. For investigators, the explanation confirmed what months of patterns had already suggested. The couple had not been wandering randomly through neighborhoods. They had been studying them, testing environments, observing how strangers reacted to uncertainty. The detectives continued asking questions about specific moments described in witness reports: the encounter near the convenience store, the brief conversation with a pedestrian who later described feeling uneasy, the car that had slowly followed another driver before turning away. Each time, Ricky and Dena offered explanations that centered on curiosity. They wanted to understand reactions. They wanted to see how people behaved when routines were disrupted. From their perspective, they had simply been exploring psychological ideas. But investigators understood something the couple had not fully acknowledged. The line between observation and influence can be very thin, and once people begin intentionally creating situations to study reactions, the consequences can become unpredictable. By the end of the conversation, detectives had gathered a clearer understanding of the couple's motivations. There was no evidence of violent intent, no indication that the pair had planned serious crimes. But their actions had nonetheless created a pattern of behavior that disturbed people across multiple communities. Strangers had felt watched. Drivers had felt uneasy. Witnesses had reported encounters that lingered in memory long after they occurred. In many ways, Ricky Davis and Dena Riley had been conducting their own version of psychological exploration, but they had done so in real environments with real people who had never agreed to be part of those experiments. As the investigators prepared to conclude the conversation, one final reality had become clear. The mysterious pattern that had puzzled detectives for months was not the work of criminals hiding in the shadows. It was the result of two individuals who had slowly convinced themselves that their curiosity about human behavior justified the strange situations they were creating. And in doing so, they had unknowingly built a trail of encounters that eventually drew the attention of investigators determined to understand what was happening. Chapter 12: Legacy of the Case. Lessons from the Ricky Davis and Dena Riley investigation. When investigators finally stepped away from the quiet house where their long conversation with Ricky Davis and Dena Riley had taken place, the case that had occupied months of observation and analysis reached an unexpected conclusion. For detectives who had spent weeks studying scattered reports and unusual patterns across several districts, the mystery had initially suggested something far darker. The repeated late-night encounters, the carefully chosen locations, and the methodical routes across quiet neighborhoods had all hinted at the possibility of criminal intent. Yet the truth that emerged during the interview was more complicated. Instead of uncovering a violent scheme or organized wrongdoing, investigators had encountered two individuals whose curiosity about human behavior had gradually pushed them into territory that others experienced as unsettling and intrusive. For Ricky and Dena, their nighttime drives had begun as a shared interest. Long conversations about psychology, perception, and how people react when confronted with unfamiliar situations. First, the exploration remained harmless. They drove through quiet streets. They observed the atmosphere of different neighborhoods after midnight. They discussed how lighting, silence, and isolation could change the way people felt about their surroundings. But over time, that curiosity grew more intense. Observation alone began to feel incomplete. They wanted to see reactions up close. They wanted to understand how individuals responded when their expectations about ordinary environments suddenly shifted. And without fully realizing the impact of those actions, They began creating small disruptions in otherwise quiet places, parking near empty intersections, approaching strangers with unusual questions, lingering in locations where people later reported feeling watched. From Ricky and Dena's perspective, these moments were simply opportunities to observe behavior. But from the perspective of the people encountering them, the experiences felt different. That a driver noticing a car slowly following behind them through empty streets, that a pedestrian sensing that someone nearby was studying their movements, that a witness spotting two individuals sitting silently in a parked car late at night. None of these moments involved direct harm. Yet they left impressions strong enough that people later reported them to authorities. Those reports became the fragments that eventually caught investigators' attention. For detectives studying the case, the investigation itself offered several important lessons. Point one of the most significant was the way small details accumulate over time. Each individual report had seemed minor. Each encounter appeared isolated. But once investigators began placing those reports into a timeline, a clear pattern emerged. Late night activity. Repeated locations point to individuals traveling together. Patterns like this are rarely visible in the beginning. They appear slowly, piece by piece, until the larger picture becomes impossible to ignore. Another lesson came from the couple's belief that their actions were invisible. During their months of exploration, Ricky and Dena had assumed that quiet streets and brief encounters meant no one was paying attention. But what they had overlooked was the way memory works. People often forget ordinary moments, but when something unusual happens, a strange conversation, a car lingering nearby, an encounter that creates unease, those moments remain in memory longer. Eventually, someone mentions the experience to a friend. Someone else reports it to a patrol officer, and slowly, the details begin to accumulate. The couple had believed they were moving through empty environments to in reality. They had been leaving traces of their presence behind them the entire time. The investigation also highlighted the difference between curiosity and responsibility. Human behavior is a fascinating subject. Psychologists and researchers spend years studying how individuals react to stress, uncertainty, and unfamiliar environments. But those studies are conducted within structured settings designed to protect the people involved. Participants know they are part of an experiment. They have the choice to participate or decline. What Ricky and Dena had been doing was something very different. They had turned ordinary environments into stages for their curiosity without the knowledge or consent of the people they encountered. Even though their intentions may not have involved harm, the effect of those encounters was still real. People felt uneasy, communities reported unusual activity, and investigators eventually had to step in to understand what was happening. By the time the case reached its conclusion, the mystery that had once puzzled detectives across several districts had finally been explained. The quiet car traveling through neighborhoods late at night, the strangers asking unusual questions, the lingering presence in parking lots and intersections. All of it had been part of a private exploration of human behavior that slowly drifted beyond the boundaries of ordinary curiosity. For the investigators who had followed the trail of reports and camera footage, the outcome offered both relief and reflection. Relief that the situation had not involved something more dangerous, and reflection on how easily unusual patterns can grow unnoticed until someone begins asking the right questions. But the story of Ricky Davis and Dena O'Reilly did not end simply with that final conversation, because the case also left behind a broader question about the thin line between observation and influence, a question that would remain long after the investigation itself had closed. In the weeks following the conversation between investigators and Ricky Davis and Dena O'Reilly, The unusual pattern that had once puzzled authorities across several districts slowly faded from public attention. The late-night drive stopped. The quiet streets where witnesses had once reported seeing a parked car remained empty again. The strange encounters that had unsettled people across several neighborhoods no longer appeared. For the detectives who had spent months studying the case, the sudden absence of activity confirmed something important. The investigation had reached its natural conclusion. The purpose of the inquiry had never been to punish curiosity or criminalize unusual behavior. Instead, the goal had been to understand whether the patterns emerging across the region represented something dangerous. Once the motivations behind the activity became clear, the situation could finally settle. But the case itself remained memorable for the investigators who had followed it from the beginning, not because it involved dramatic crimes or violent confrontations, but because it revealed how easily human curiosity can drift into unexpected territory when it is not balanced by awareness of how others experience the same situation. For Ricky and Dena, their fascination with human behavior had grown slowly over time. That IT began with conversations, long drives where they discussed psychology, perception, and the small details that shape how people interpret the world around them. They became interested in how lighting affects a person's sense of safety, how silence in a quiet neighborhood changes the way footsteps sound on pavement, how individuals react when they feel uncertain about their surroundings. Those questions were not unusual in themselves. Researchers and psychologists have explored similar ideas for generations, but the difference between research and personal curiosity lies in structure. Researchers conduct studies within clear boundaries designed to protect participants. Participants understand what is happening. They consent to being involved. The environment is controlled. What Ricky and Dena had done lacked those boundaries. Their curiosity had moved into public spaces where the people they encountered had no way of understanding the context behind those strange moments. To the couple, the encounters were observations, but to the people experiencing them, the moments felt unpredictable and unsettling. That a car moving slowly behind them on a quiet road point to strangers sitting silently in a parked vehicle. Unexpected questions in an otherwise empty place late at night. Those experiences stayed with people long after they occurred, and when enough individuals reported similar encounters, investigators began noticing the pattern. For the detectives involved, the case reinforced one of the most fundamental realities of investigative work. Small details matter. That a single report rarely reveals the full story. But when many small observations begin pointing in the same direction, the pattern eventually becomes impossible to ignore. The case also demonstrated something about perception itself. Ricky and Dena had believed they were invisible. They assumed the quiet hours of the night meant no one was watching. But in reality, the world is rarely as empty as it seems. Someone always notices something unusual. Someone always remembers a moment that felt slightly out of place. And when those memories accumulate, they begin forming connections that investigators eventually followed. In the end, the story of Ricky Davis and Dena Riley became less about mystery and more about understanding how perception shapes human behavior, both for the people observing a situation and for the people experiencing it. To the couple, their nighttime drives felt like exploration. To the witnesses encountering them, the same actions created uncertainty, and to investigators studying the pattern, those encounters suggested a puzzle that needed to be solved. Three different perspectives, three different interpretations of the same events. It is often said that human behavior becomes most interesting when it is viewed through multiple lenses: the observer, the participant, and the investigator. In this case, all three perspectives existed at once. And only when those perspectives finally intersected did the full story emerge. Today, the neighborhoods where the strange encounters once occurred have returned to their ordinary routines. Streetlights glow quietly along familiar roads. Cars pass through intersections without hesitation. People move through their environments without noticing the patterns that once fascinated the couple who studied those same streets so carefully. Life has a way of returning to normal once unusual moments fade in a memory. But for those who followed the investigation closely, the case left behind a simple but powerful reminder. The world is filled with patterns. Some are obvious. Others remain hidden until someone takes the time to look closely enough. And sometimes, the most intriguing mysteries are not about crime or danger at all. Sometimes they are simply about the complicated ways people observe, influence, and interpret the world around them.